Chapter 1, Shipwreck and Awakening. Will Farnaby's arrival on Pala is anything but gentle. After his small boat is wrecked on the rocks surrounding the island, he finds himself injured, disoriented, and stranded on a remote beach. His shoulder is badly hurt, possibly dislocated, and he is in considerable pain. As he lies on the sand, drifting in and out of consciousness, his first encounter with the island comes through an absurd and irritating sound, a bird voice repeatedly crying attention, and here and now. The myna bird's insistent calls seem to will like a mockery of his situation. Here he is, shipwrecked, injured, his mission in jeopardy, and some bird is telling him to pay attention. Pay attention to what? His pain? His failure? The absurdity of his predicament? Will's initial response is characteristic: irritation and cynicism. The bird represents everything he will come to learn about Pala, the constant emphasis on present-moment awareness. But at this point, it simply annoys him. Will's situation is complicated by the nature of his mission. He is not merely a journalist, though that is his cover story. He has been sent to Pala by Lord Aldehyde, Joe Aldehyde, as he prefers to be called, a British petroleum magnate who has learned that the island sits atop substantial oil reserves. For over a century, Pala has maintained its isolation and refused to exploit these resources or allow outsiders to do so. Aldehyde wants to change that, and Will's job is to help negotiate access to the oil, using whatever means necessary: charm, bribery, manipulation, or exploitation of internal conflicts. Will is well suited to this role, not because he is particularly evil, but because he is profoundly cynical. His own life has been a series of disappointments and betrayals, and he has come to assume that everyone acts from self-interest and that idealistic claims are always covers for baser motives. He doesn't believe in the possibility of genuine goodness, so he feels no compunction about helping to destroy it. If he doesn't do it, someone else will. This is his operating philosophy. As Will lies on the beach, he reflects on the events that brought him here. His marriage to Molly had been a disaster from the start, though it took years to fully fall apart. She was the daughter of a wealthy family, beautiful and intelligent, but also cold and critical. Will had been attracted to her sophistication and what he thought was her depth, but the reality was mutual manipulation and growing contempt. He had been unfaithful, more out of revenge and the need to prove something to himself than from any real passion. She had retreated into a kind of brittle superiority, drinking too much and making cutting remarks. Then Molly got cancer. The diagnosis was late and the prognosis was poor. The disease progressed rapidly, and within months she was dead. Will's handling of this crisis revealed the depths of his emotional dysfunction. He couldn't face her dying, couldn't be present with her suffering. He drank heavily, spent as much time away as possible, and when he was with her, he was either falsely cheerful or silent and withdrawn. Molly died in a morphine haze, and Will was drunk. They never had a real conversation about what was happening, never said goodbye in any meaningful way. After her death, Will descended into full-fledged alcoholism for a time. He was rescued from this by Joe Aldehyde, who saw in Will's cynicism and amorality someone who could be useful. Aldehyde offered him work, journalism with a slant, PR that shaded into propaganda, and occasionally more direct forms of influence peddling. The Pala assignment represented a significant promotion. If Will could help deliver the oil rights, he would be rewarded handsomely and given access to the inner circles of power and wealth. Will's thoughts are interrupted by voices. A young boy and a girl have discovered him on the beach. The boy is perhaps 13 or 14, the girl slightly younger. Will expects them to be frightened or at least hesitant around a strange injured man, but they approach with calm competence. The boy introduces himself as Murugan Mailendra, and as they talk, Will realizes with a start that this is the young Raja of Pala, the nominal ruler of the island. Murugan and his companion, Mary Sarajini, immediately set about helping Will. They examine his shoulder with surprising knowledge and skill for their age, determining that it is dislocated but not broken. They explain that they need to get him to Dr. Robert MacPhail, one of the island's physicians. They fashion a temporary sling from vines and help Will to his feet. As they walk slowly along the beach and then up a path into the forest, Will begins to observe his rescuers more closely. There is something different about these children, though he cannot quite articulate what it is. They are composed without being stiff, serious without being solemn, helpful without being obsequious. They seem comfortable in their own skins in a way that Will associates with adults, yet they are clearly still children. They laugh and joke with each other, but there is none of the awkwardness or self-consciousness he would expect. The forest through which they walk is lush and beautiful. Giant trees rise overhead, their canopy filtering the tropical sunlight into a green, dappled glow. The air is filled with bird calls and the sound of insects. The path is well maintained but not paved, winding naturally through the landscape. Everything seems designed with care, but without the obvious imposition of human will on nature. As they walk, Murugan chatters about various things: school, his friends, the festival coming up next month. Will tries to draw him out about the island's politics and economy, but Murugan seems remarkably uninterested in such matters. He does mention, however, that he will soon be going abroad for further education, which his mother, the Rani, has arranged. This catches Will's attention. A young ruler being educated outside his isolated kingdom suggests possibilities for influence and manipulation. The group is accompanied by myna birds that seem to follow them through the forest, periodically calling out attention. And here and now. When Will asks about this in an irritated tone, Mary Sarajini explains that the birds have been trained for generations to make these calls as reminders. Reminders of what? Will asks. To be here, Mary says simply, as if this explained everything. To pay attention to what's actually happening instead of being lost in thoughts about the past or worries about the future. Will finds this explanation both intriguing and annoying. It seems like a kind of behavioral conditioning, using birds as constant reminders of some philosophical principle. He wonders what else might be conditioned into the population through such means. His journalist instincts, honed through years of looking for the angle or the hidden story, make him suspicious. What are they really doing here? What is this emphasis on attention meant to accomplish? Is it a form of social control, keeping people passive and present-focused so they don't question authority or plan resistance? These thoughts occupy Will as they make their way through the forest. The pain in his shoulder is constant but bearable, and the beauty of the surroundings is undeniable. Despite his cynicism and his mission, Will finds himself experiencing moments of genuine presence, times when the constant chatter of his thinking mind quiets and he simply perceives what is around him. The dappled light, the calls of birds, the feel of the humid air on his skin, the sound of the children's voices, these become vivid in a way that transcends his usual filtered perception. When a myna bird lands on a branch directly above him and calls out attention, "Here and now, boys," Will actually laughs, not with derision but with genuine amusement. Perhaps there is something to this after all, he thinks, before his habitual skepticism reasserts itself. Still, something has shifted, however slightly. The door to a different way of being has opened a crack, and Will has glimpsed something through it, even if he doesn't yet understand what he has seen. They emerge from the forest into cultivated land, rice terraces that cascade down the hillside in elegant curves, following the natural contours of the land. Workers are in the fields, and they wave cheerfully to Murugan and Mary. Will notes that the workers seem happy, singing as they work, and he wonders about this. Are they really content? Or is this a performance for visitors? His instinct is to assume the latter, but he reserves judgment. Finally, they arrive at a compound of buildings, traditional Palanese architecture made of wood and thatch but clearly well-maintained and comfortable. This is Dr. Robert MacPhail's home and clinic. An older man emerges, lean and tall with white hair and a weathered face that radiates calm intelligence. This is Dr. Robert, and as he greets the group and immediately turns his attention to Will's injury, Will has his first encounter with the kind of person who will challenge all his assumptions about human nature and social possibility. Chapter 2. First Impressions and Dr. Robert MacPhail. Dr. Robert MacPhail examines Will's shoulder with gentle, skilled hands. He is perhaps 70, with the kind of presence that commands attention without demanding it. His movements are economical and precise, his voice soft but clear. As he probes the injury, he explains what he is finding and what he will need to do. The shoulder is indeed dislocated, and it will need to be reduced, put back in place, which will be painful but necessary. Will braces himself for agony, but Dr. Robert first administers a local anesthetic and then guides Will through a breathing technique designed to help him relax and manage pain. Breathe into the pain, Dr. Robert instructs. Don't fight it or try to escape it. Just observe it, be curious about it. Pain is just a sensation, and you are the awareness that experiences the sensation. They're not the same thing. This strikes Will as philosophical nonsense, but he follows the instructions, and to his surprise, he finds that his experience of the pain does shift. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes less overwhelming, less all-consuming. With a deft movement, Dr. Robert reduces the dislocation. There is a moment of intense pain, and then sudden relief as the joint returns to its proper position. Dr. Robert fashions a proper sling and gives Will instructions for care and recovery. He also provides some tablets, a mild analgesic and an anti-inflammatory. Will expects to be dismissed at this point, but instead, Dr. Robert invites him to sit on the veranda for tea and conversation. As they settle into comfortable chairs overlooking a garden, Dr. Robert begins to ask Will about himself, where he's from, what brought him to Paula, what his plans are. Will has his cover story ready. He's a journalist doing a piece on remote societies in the modern world. He's careful not to reveal his connection to aldehyde or his true purpose. Dr. Robert listens attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions, and Will has the uncomfortable sensation that the old doctor sees through his lies but is too polite to call him out directly. The conversation shifts to Paula itself, and Dr. Robert begins to tell the island's history. In the 1840s, his grandfather, Andrew MacPhail, was a ship's surgeon on a vessel that foundered near Paula. He was the sole survivor and was rescued by the Palanese. The ruling Raja at the time, Murugan's great-great-grandfather, was a remarkable man, intelligent, curious, and progressive in his thinking. He and Dr. Andrew MacPhail became close friends despite their different backgrounds and cultures. Together, they conceived an ambitious project to create a society that synthesized the best elements of both Eastern and Western civilizations while avoiding the pitfalls of each. Dr. Andrew brought Western science, medicine, and Enlightenment rationalism. The Raja brought Buddhist wisdom, Hindu philosophy, and traditional Palanese culture. They were not naive. They understood that any social experiment would face challenges and that human nature includes destructive as well as creative potentials. But they believed it was worth attempting to create a society explicitly designed to promote human flourishing. Over the next several decades, they and their successors developed the systems and institutions that define Palan society. They reformed education, creating schools that educated the whole person. They developed agricultural practices that were sustainable and productive. They integrated modern medicine with traditional healing. They created political institutions that balanced freedom with social cohesion. They addressed sexuality, death, and spirituality in ways that Western society had fumbled or repressed. Will listens to this history with his habitual skepticism. It sounds too good to be true, which in his experience means it probably is. He suspects that Dr. Robert is giving him the official propaganda version, leaving out the dark underbelly that every society has. But as he listens, he is also struck by Dr. Robert's thoughtfulness and lack of dogmatism. The old doctor freely acknowledges problems and failures. He admits that the Palan experiment is ongoing and imperfect. He doesn't claim to have created paradise, only a society that takes seriously the question of how human beings might live well. The conversation turns to the myna birds and the practice of attention or mindfulness. Dr. Robert explains that this practice draws on Buddhist meditation traditions but has been adapted for everyday life. The goal is not to spend hours in formal sitting meditation, though some people do this, but to cultivate moment-to-moment awareness in all activities. The myna birds serve as constant reminders, behavioral cues that interrupt habitual patterns of mind wandering and bring people back to present experience. Most people, Dr. Robert explains, spend very little time actually present to their lives. They're lost in thoughts about the past, regrets, resentments, nostalgia, or they're caught up in worries and fantasies about the future, fears, ambitions, plans. Meanwhile, life, actual life, the only life there really is happening right now and they're missing it. The birds are just one of many techniques we use to help people wake up to the present moment. Will challenges this, but don't you need to think about the past and future? Isn't that what separates humans from animals, our ability to remember, plan, imagine? Dr. Robert agrees that these capacities are valuable and important. The goal is not to eliminate thinking about past and future, but to be aware when you're doing it, and to be able to choose to return to present experience when appropriate. There's a difference, he says, between using your mind as a tool and being used by your mind as if you were its tool. Most people are enslaved by their thinking, constantly at the mercy of whatever thoughts arise. We teach people to have a different relationship with thinking, to use it when useful but not be dominated by it. This strikes Will as interesting, but also as potentially dangerous from a social control perspective. A population trained to focus on the present moment might be easier to manipulate, less likely to question authority or organize resistance to injustice. He voices this concern, and Dr. Robert responds seriously. It's a valid worry. He acknowledges, mindfulness without wisdom and ethical commitment could indeed be used for oppression. That's why we don't teach attention in isolation. It's always part of a broader education that includes critical thinking, ethical reflection, and understanding of social systems. We want people who are both present and awake, both aware and engaged. The conversation continues for some time, ranging over various topics. Dr. Robert is clearly well-read in both Eastern and Western philosophy, quoting easily from Buddhist texts, Hindu scriptures, Western mystics, and modern thinkers. Yet there is nothing pedantic about him. His knowledge seems to emerge naturally from genuine understanding rather than mere scholarship. As the afternoon wears on, we'll feel something unexpected. He is enjoying this conversation. It has been years since he has engaged in genuine intellectual exchange without hidden agendas or posturing. Dr. Robert seems genuinely interested in what Will thinks, genuinely curious about his reactions and questions. There is no attempt to convert or convince, only an invitation to consider and explore. Eventually, the conversation turns to practical matters. Where will stay while he recovers? Dr. Robert offers his own guest house, explaining that hospitality is a duty and pleasure in Palin culture. Will accepts, realizing that this arrangement will give him excellent access to observe Palin life up close, useful for his mission. Yet even as he thinks this, he feels a twinge of something that might be shame or conscience. These people are showing him genuine kindness, and he is planning to betray them. The feeling is brief, quickly suppressed, but it has arisen, and that in itself is notable for someone as practiced in cynicism as Will Farnaby. Before they part for the evening, Dr. Robert mentions that his daughter-in-law, Susilla, will be coming by in the morning to help with Will's care and to serve as his guide to Palin life. You'll like Susilla, Dr. Robert says with a warm smile. Everyone does. She has a gift for helping people see things clearly. Will nods politely, already beginning to construct his defenses against whatever charm offensive awaits him. He does not yet know that Susilla Macphail will become the catalyst for his transformation, the person who will reach past his defenses to the buried pain and possibility within him. Chapter 3: Education and the Whole Child. Will wakes the next morning with his shoulder still aching but significantly improved. He is brought breakfast, fresh fruit, rice, and a kind of spiced tea, by a young woman who introduces herself cheerfully and then departs, leaving him to eat on the veranda of the guest house. The morning is beautiful, with birds singing in the garden and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of flowers. As he eats, Will observes the compound. Dr. Robert's home is part of a cluster of buildings that seem to serve various functions: living quarters, a small clinic, what might be a library or study. Everything is clean and well-maintained without being obsessively neat. There is a sense of order that feels organic rather than imposed. Children's voices can be heard in the distance, laughing and calling to each other. Susilla Macphail arrives as Will is finishing his breakfast. She is in her early 30s, attractive in a natural, unadorned way. Her face shows traces of sadness around the eyes, but her smile is warm and genuine. She asks about Will's shoulder, examines the dressing, and pronounces herself satisfied with his recovery. Then she asks if he would be interested in visiting a school that morning. You said you're interested in Palin society, she notes. There's no better place to understand a society than to see how it educates its children. Will agrees, partly because it fits his cover story as a journalist and partly because he is genuinely curious. They set out on foot through the compound and then along paths through cultivated land and forest. As they walk, Susilla tells him about herself. She was married to Dr. Robert's son, Dugald, who died in a climbing accident several months ago. They had no children, which she says with a hint of regret. She works as what the Palinese call a conversation guide, something like a therapist or counselor, helping people work through difficult experiences and psychological challenges. They arrive at a school that consists of several open-sided buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Children of various ages are engaged in different activities. Some are in what looks like a traditional classroom setting, gathered around a teacher who is leading a discussion. Others are working in a garden, learning about plants and cultivation. Still others are engaged in what appears to be some kind of movement or dance practice. Susilla leads Will to observe a class of children who appear to be around 10 or 11 years old. The teacher, a middle-aged woman named Amrita, welcomes them, and invites them to sit quietly at the back. The lesson currently underway is about perception and attention. Amrita is showing the children a series of optical illusions, images that can be seen in multiple ways depending on how you focus your attention. The classic image of the old woman/young woman, the rabbit/duck, the face/face. The point, Amrita explains to the children, is that what we perceive depends partly on objective reality, but also partly on how we direct our attention and what assumptions we bring. Your mind is constantly interpreting, she says. It's constantly deciding what's important and what to ignore, what something means, whether it's good or bad. This process usually happens automatically, without awareness. But you can learn to become aware of it. You can learn to notice when your mind is interpreting and to question whether that interpretation is accurate or helpful. The children are engaged and asking questions. One boy asks whether this means you can never know what's really real. Amrita handles this philosophical question with respect, not dismissing it as too complex for a child. That's an excellent question, she says. The answer is that there are different levels of reality. This table is really here, you can touch it, it has weight and substance. But your interpretation of whether it's a beautiful table or an ugly one, whether you like it or not, that's something your mind adds. And sometimes your mind adds interpretations to much more important things, whether you're a good person or a bad person, whether someone likes you or not, whether you're safe or in danger. Learning to distinguish between what's objectively real and what's interpretation is one of the most important skills you can develop. Will is impressed despite himself. This is sophisticated psychology being taught to 10-year-olds in a way that is accessible and practical. The lesson continues with exercises in attention. The children are asked to close their eyes and focus on sounds, identifying as many different sounds as they can. Then they open their eyes and look at an object, really look at it, seeing its colors, shapes, and textures without naming or judging. These are basic mindfulness exercises, but they're being taught as ordinary life skills, like reading or arithmetic. After the perception lesson, the class transitions to what Amrita calls practical psychology. The children gather in a circle, and Amrita introduces a scenario. Imagine you've been looking forward to going to the beach with your friends all week. But then, on the day you're supposed to go, your parents say you have to stay home and help with chores instead. How might you feel? The children respond with various emotions: angry, disappointed, frustrated, sad. Amrita then guides them through an exploration of these feelings. Where do you feel anger in your body? She asks. The children describe sensations: heat in the chest, tension in the jaw, clenched fists. And what thoughts come with anger? Amrita continues. The children identify thoughts like it's not fair, and I hate my parents, and they don't care about what I want. Then comes the crucial part. Now, Amrita says, are the thoughts true? Do your parents really not care about what you want, or are they asking you to help with something important? Is it really true that this one missed trip means the day is completely ruined, or could there be other good things about the day? She's teaching them to question their automatic interpretations, to separate facts from stories, to recognize that feelings, while real and valid, are often based on stories that may not be accurate. This is cognitive behavioral therapy being taught to 10-year-olds as basic education. Will is stunned. In his own childhood, no one ever taught him to understand his emotions or question his thoughts. Feelings were either expressed explosively or repressed entirely. The idea that children could learn to work with their own minds in this sophisticated way challenges his assumptions about both education and human development. After the practical psychology lesson, the class breaks up and the children move to different activities based on their interests and needs. Some go to work on academic subjects: math, reading, history, science. Others head to the workshop for hands-on projects. Still others go to the gymnasium for physical education. Suzilla explains that while there is a common curriculum that all children learn, there is also significant flexibility for individual interests and learning styles. Will and Suzilla follow a group heading to what is called Awareness Through Movement class. This is a kind of physical education, but very different from the competitive sports that Will remembers from his own schooling. The instructor, a man named Ranga, leads the children through a series of movements and postures drawn from yoga, dance, and martial arts. The emphasis is not on competition or performance, but on body awareness, coordination, and the integration of mind and body. Your body knows things your mind doesn't, Ranga tells the children. When you're scared or anxious, your body knows before you think about it. Your heartbeat increases, your breathing changes, your muscles tense. When you're happy, your body knows. You feel lighter, more energized, you want to move and dance. By learning to pay attention to your body, you can become aware of your emotions earlier and work with them more skillfully. The children practice noticing their breathing, becoming aware of tension in different parts of their bodies, moving in ways that release or express different emotional states. It's utterly unlike the aggressive, competitive physical education of Will's youth. Instead of learning to dominate opponents or push through pain, these children are learning to inhabit their bodies with awareness and care. During a break, Will asks Suzilla about sex education, expecting that this traditional-seeming culture might be repressive in this area. To his surprise, Suzilla explains that sex education begins early and is comprehensive. Children learn age-appropriate information about anatomy, reproduction, and sexuality from the time they're young. By the age of these children, they know the basic facts about sexual development, puberty, and reproduction. But it's not just biological information, Suzilla explains. We teach them about consent, about respect, about the emotional dimensions of sexuality. We help them understand that sexual feelings are natural and healthy, not shameful, but also that there's a time and place for sexual activity and that it comes with responsibilities. By the time young people become sexually active, usually in their mid to late teens, they have a thorough understanding of both the pleasures and the responsibilities of sexuality. Will is both impressed and slightly scandalized by this frankness. In the world he comes from, sex is either repressed and shrouded in shame or treated as a mere commodity, something to be consumed or marketed. The Palin approach, which treats sexuality as a natural and potentially sacred part of human life, is utterly foreign to him. Yet he can see the wisdom in it. These children are being educated to have healthy, responsible, joyful sexual lives, free from the shame and dysfunction that plague so many people in other societies. The morning continues with visits to other parts of the school. Will observes a class in critical thinking where children are learning to analyze arguments, identify logical fallacies, and distinguish evidence from opinion. Another class is studying ecology, learning about interconnection and sustainability through hands-on work in the school garden. Yet another is engaged in what Amrita calls ethics lab, where children work through moral dilemmas and develop their capacity for ethical reasoning. What strikes Will most forcefully is the integration of all these elements. Academic learning, emotional education, physical development, ethical formation, and spiritual awareness are not separated into distinct domains, but are woven together into a holistic approach to education. The goal is not to produce scholars or athletes or workers, but to develop complete human beings who can think clearly, feel deeply, act ethically, and live with joy and purpose. During lunch, which they share with some of the teachers, Will raises the question that has been nagging at him. This all seems admirable, he says, but doesn't it require extraordinary teachers? How do you find and train people capable of this kind of complex, integrated education? The teachers laugh, not mockingly but with genuine amusement at his assumption. Amrita responds, "We don't think of it as requiring extraordinary teachers because teaching like this is the norm here. Every teacher receives thorough training not just in subject matter, but in psychology, mindfulness, and pedagogy. More importantly, teachers themselves go through the same kind of education we're providing to children. We've all practiced mindfulness, worked through our own psychological issues, learned to integrate body and mind. You can't teach what you haven't experienced yourself." This makes sense to Will, but it also highlights the challenge of exporting the Palin model. In other societies, teachers are often underpaid, undertrained, and overwhelmed. They're expected to control large classes of children and drill them in standardized curricula. The Palin approach requires a completely different social commitment to education, one that treats it as the most important work of civilization rather than as an expense to be minimized. Before they leave the school, Suzilla introduces Will to another crucial element of Palin education, the mutual adoption club system. She explains that every child, in addition to their biological parents, belongs to a MAC, a group of several families who commit to caring for the child. If there are conflicts with biological parents, if a child needs space or perspective, they can stay with one of their adopted families. This provides emotional support, reduces the intensity and potential damage of family conflicts, and gives children multiple adult role models. It's based on the recognition, Suzilla explains, that the nuclear family is too small, too isolated, too intense for healthy child-rearing. In traditional societies, extended families and whole villages raised children. But we've also seen the problems that can come with traditional extended families: rigidity, oppressive hierarchy, limited opportunities for women. The MAC system tries to get the benefits of broader family networks without the drawbacks. Will thinks about his own childhood, raised by his Aunt Mary after his parents died. There had been no broader family network, no alternative adult figures he could turn to when Mary was being particularly harsh or controlling. He had been trapped with her, subject to her moods and her rigid religious judgments. How different might his life have been if he'd had adopted families, other homes to visit, other perspectives on who he could become? As they walk back to Dr. Roberts' compound, Will finds himself in turmoil. Everything he's observed this morning challenges his cynical assumptions. These aren't people being indoctrinated or controlled. They're being educated in the deepest sense, being drawn out, developed, helped to realize their potential. The children are genuinely happy, engaged, curious, and thoughtful. The teachers are dedicated and skilled. The whole enterprise seems to be working exactly as intended, yet Will's cynicism is deeply entrenched, a protective armor built over decades. He tells himself that he's only seeing what they want him to see, that there must be problems they're hiding, that no society can be this good. But even as he thinks these things, he knows he's grasping for reasons to dismiss what he's witnessed. The cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable, and Will does what he usually does with discomfort. He tries to think about something else, to distract himself with plans and schemes for his real mission on the island. Chapter 4. Suzilla, Grief, and the Work of Mourning. Over the next several days, as Will's shoulder continues to heal, he spends increasing amounts of time with Suzilla MacPhail. She seems to have been assigned as his primary guide to Palin life, though assigned seems too formal a word for what feels like a natural friendship developing. They walk through the island together, visit different sites and institutions, and have long conversations about everything from philosophy to personal experience. Suzilla is unlike anyone Will has known before. She combines intellectual sophistication with emotional openness, spiritual depth with practical wisdom, strength with gentleness. She is clearly still mourning her husband's death. Will sees the shadow of grief pass across her face at unexpected moments, but she is not broken or diminished by her loss. If anything, there is a depth to her presence that suggests her grief has deepened rather than diminished her capacity for life. One afternoon, as they sit by a stream in the forest, Will asks her directly about Dugald's death. He expects her to deflect or change the subject. In his experience, people don't like to talk about painful losses, but Suzilla responds with unexpected openness. "Thank you for asking," she says. "Most people are afraid to mention it, as if not talking about Dugald means I'm not thinking about him. But I think about him every day, and it helps to be able to talk about him." She describes how Dugald died. He had been an avid climber, one of the few Palinese who pursued mountaineering as a serious sport. He was attempting a difficult route on one of the island's high peaks when the rock gave way beneath him. He fell perhaps 100 feet before the rope arrested his fall, but the impact caused severe internal injuries. His companions got him down to the valley, but it took hours, and by the time they reached medical help, there was little that could be done. What strikes Will most is how Suzilla describes those final hours. Dugald remained conscious almost to the end. He was in pain but not panicked. He knew he was dying, and rather than denying it or fighting it with futile desperation, he accepted it. He said goodbye to Suzilla, told her he loved her, spoke of his gratitude for the life they'd shared. He gave instructions about practical matters, his wishes for his body, messages for friends. And then, with Dr. Robert and Suzilla beside him, he died consciously, using meditation techniques to remain aware and present even as his body failed. "It sounds impossible," Suzilla says, "doesn't it? How can someone be peaceful when they're dying?" Dugald had been preparing for death his whole life, we all do here. Not in a morbid way, but by practicing acceptance, by learning to let go of attachment, by understanding that everything is impermanent, including ourselves. When the time came, he was ready. Not happy about dying, he was only 35, we had so much life ahead of us, but not terrified either. He died well. Will is stunned by this account. He thinks of Molly's death, which had been nothing like this. She had been drugged into unconsciousness, surrounded by machines, dying in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and fear. Neither of them had been able to face what was happening. There had been no goodbyes, no expression of love or gratitude, no conscious release. just a slow fading into oblivion while we'll sat in a chair, half-drunk, unable to look at her. How did you cope afterward? Will asks. I mean, how did you deal with the grief? This question is more personal than he intends, reflecting his own unprocessed mourning for Molly. Suzilla seems to understand this, and her answer is directed not just at Will's question, but at Will himself. The Palanese way of grieving, she explains, is different from what I understand is common in the West. We don't believe in suppressing grief or getting over it quickly or pretending everything is fine. We believe grief needs to be fully felt and expressed, but we also don't believe in being overwhelmed by it or stuck in it forever. There's a middle way, allowing grief while also returning to life. She describes the practices that helped her. Immediately after Dugald's death, there was a community ritual where friends and family gathered to mourn together. People told stories about Dugald, expressed their feelings, wept openly. This public mourning, Suzilla explains, is important. It acknowledges the reality of the loss and provides social support. In the West, she says, I think people are often very isolated in their grief. They're supposed to grieve privately, quickly, without burdening others. Here, we grieve together. After the initial period of intense mourning, Suzilla worked with a grief counselor, someone trained in helping people navigate loss. This involved both talking about her feelings and memories and also specific practices for working through grief. She learned meditation techniques for being with painful emotions without being overwhelmed by them. She practiced what the Palanese call somatic awareness, paying attention to how grief manifests in the body and learning to release physical tension and blocked energy. One of the most helpful practices, Suzilla says, was something we call loving memory meditation. You deliberately bring up memories of the person, happy memories and sad ones, and you let yourself feel all the feelings that come: love, loss, joy at having known them, pain at their absence. You don't try to escape the pain, but you also don't drown in it. You hold both the love and the loss together, and gradually over time, the balance shifts. The pain becomes less sharp, though it never disappears completely, and you're left with love and gratitude for having known them. As Suzilla talks, Will feels his own grief rising, not just for Molly but for all the losses he's never properly mourned, including, he realizes, the loss of his own capacity for love and connection. Tears come to his eyes and he tries to blink them away, embarrassed. But Suzilla reaches out and touches his hand gently. It's okay to cry, she says softly. Tears are how grief leaves the body. You don't have to hide them. This simple permission, combined with Suzilla's compassionate presence, breaks through Will's defenses. He finds himself crying, not the bitter, drunken weeping of his worst times after Molly's death, but something cleaner, more healing. He cries for Molly, for the marriage they failed to create, for his own emotional poverty and inability to be present with her suffering. He cries for his lonely childhood with Aunt Mary, for the love he never received and never learned to give. He cries for himself, for the wasted years of cynicism and manipulation, for the authentic life he has never lived. Suzilla says nothing, just sits with him, her hand on his. Her presence is not intrusive but supportive. She's simply there, bearing witness to his pain without trying to fix it or make it go away. This, Will realizes, is what he needed with Molly and never had, someone to simply be present with suffering without needing it to be different. When his tears subside, Will feels embarrassed and tries to apologize, but Suzilla stops him. Don't apologize for feeling, she says. Apologize for causing harm, not for being human. They sit in silence for a while, listening to the stream, and Will feel something he hasn't felt in years, a sense of peace, of being okay despite his pain, of being connected to another human being in an authentic way. The conversation turns to the Palan understanding of attachment and non-attachment, which Suzilla explains is often misunderstood. People think non-attachment means not caring, being emotionally distant, not forming bonds. But that's not it at all. Non-attachment doesn't mean not loving, it means loving without clinging. It means being fully present with someone, fully committed, fully engaged, while also accepting that everything is impermanent, that loss is inevitable, that nothing lasts forever. This paradox, loving deeply while accepting inevitable loss, is central to Palan philosophy. Suzilla explains that it's based on Buddhist teachings about impermanence and suffering, but interpreted in a life-affirming rather than life-denying way. The fact that something ends doesn't make it meaningless, she says. If anything, impermanence makes things more precious. Every moment with someone you love is unique and irreplaceable precisely because it won't last forever. She describes how this understanding shaped her relationship with Dugald. They loved each other deeply, were committed to each other fully, but they also practiced what they called conscious loving, being aware that their time together was finite, that one day one of them would die and leave the other. This awareness didn't make them morbid or reduce their joy. Instead, it made them more present, more grateful, more intentional about how they spent their time together. When Dougal died, Susilla says, "It was devastating. I wouldn't minimize that. But it wasn't a complete catastrophe either, because I knew it was coming someday. Not the specific accident, of course, but the fact of eventual separation. So I had already been practicing letting go, practicing acceptance, practicing gratitude for what we had rather than taking it for granted. And that made the grief bearable, painful but not destroying." This conversation marks a turning point in Will's relationship with Susilla and with his own emotional life. For the first time in years, perhaps in his entire adult life, he has allowed himself to be vulnerable with another person. He has shown his pain rather than hiding it behind cynicism or aggression. And Susilla has responded not with judgment or discomfort, but with compassion and acceptance. This experience gives Will a glimpse of a different way of being in relationship, one based on authenticity rather than manipulation, on emotional honesty rather than defensive posturing. Over the following days, Will finds himself drawn to Susilla in multiple ways. There is certainly attraction. She is beautiful, intelligent, and deeply present. But it's more than sexual attraction. It's the recognition of someone who embodies possibilities he didn't know existed. She is living proof that it's possible to love deeply without clutching desperately, to face loss without being destroyed by it, to maintain joy and presence even while carrying grief. She represents a kind of emotional and spiritual maturity that Will has never achieved and barely imagined possible. At the same time, Will is aware of the contradiction between his growing appreciation for Susilla and Palin life and his ongoing mission to help exploit the island. The cognitive dissonance is becoming harder to ignore. He is supposed to be gathering information, making contacts, identifying vulnerabilities that can be exploited to gain access to Paula's oil. Instead, he is spending his days learning about mindfulness and grief work, having his assumptions challenged, and experiencing genuine connection with people he is supposed to betray. The question of what he will ultimately choose, loyalty to his mission or loyalty to these new relationships and understandings, is beginning to press on him, though he is not yet ready to confront it directly. Chapter 5. The Moksha Medicine and Doors of Perception. Several days into his stay on Pala, Will learns about one of the most controversial and misunderstood aspects of Palin society, their sacramental use of a consciousness-expanding substance they call the Moksha Medicine. The revelation comes during a dinner conversation with Dr. Robert, Susilla, and several other Palinese friends and community members. The discussion begins when someone mentions an upcoming festival that will include a moksha ceremony for some young people who are coming of age. Will asks what this means, and Dr. Robert explains that the moksha medicine is derived from a local mushroom that contains compounds similar to psilocybin or mescaline. It's a powerful entheogen, Dr. Robert says, using a term Will doesn't recognize. That means it can induce experiences of expanded consciousness, mystical states, profound insights into the nature of mind and reality. Will's immediate reaction is skepticism verging on alarm. He associates psychedelic drugs with the counterculture he's observed from a distance: hippies, irresponsible drug use, people frying their brains and dropping out of society. The idea that a seemingly rational, functional society would institutionalize drug use strikes him as either naive or sinister, depending on how you look at it. Dr. Robert seems to anticipate these concerns. "I know how this must sound to someone from the West," he says. "In your societies, consciousness-altering substances are associated with either medical pathology, addiction, substance abuse, or with recreational intoxication and escape, but neither of those frameworks applies to how we use the moksha medicine." He explains that the use of entheogens on Pala is ancient, predating the Mac-Phail experiment by centuries. What Dr. Andrew Mac-Phail and the Raja did was to integrate this traditional practice with modern psychological understanding and safety protocols. The moksha medicine is not used casually or frequently. It is administered in specific, carefully structured contexts. As part of the initiation into adulthood, during certain religious ceremonies, as an aid in psychotherapy for people working through trauma or psychological blocks, and occasionally for elderly people as part of their preparation for death. The key, Dr. Robert emphasizes, is set and setting, preparation and integration. Set means the psychological and spiritual mindset of the person taking the medicine. Setting means the physical and social environment where the experience takes place. We prepare people carefully before a moksha experience. They learn meditation, they understand what to expect, they clarify their intentions. The experience itself takes place in a supportive environment with trained guides present. And afterward, there is extensive integration work, talking about the experience, understanding its insights, incorporating them into daily life. Suzilla adds her perspective. She has been a moksha guide many times, helping people navigate their experiences. The medicine doesn't give you anything that isn't already latent in your consciousness, she explains. What it does is temporarily dissolve the usual boundaries and filters that structure ordinary perception. It allows you to see reality without the lens of ego, to experience consciousness beyond the narrow constraints of the thinking mind, to access dimensions of awareness that are always present but usually unconscious. We'll remain skeptical. But can't you achieve those states through meditation or other practices without drugs? Dr. Robert nods. Absolutely, and many people do. The moksha medicine is not a substitute for daily practice. It's a complement to it. Think of it as a telescope. With your naked eyes, you can see stars, and that's valuable. But with a telescope, you can see much farther, with much greater clarity. The telescope doesn't create the stars, they are already there. It just reveals what was hidden. The conversation becomes more philosophical as Dr. Robert explains the Palin theory behind the use of entheogens. Normal waking consciousness, he argues, is actually a very narrow and selective form of awareness. The brain is primarily an organ of elimination rather than production. It filters out the vast majority of sensory input and potential awareness to allow us to function in everyday life. This filtering is necessary for survival and practical action, but it also creates a kind of prison, limiting our perception and trapping us in habitual patterns of thought and feeling. What we call the ego, Dr. Robert says, is really just a construct, a story we tell ourselves about who we are. It's useful for navigating social life and managing practical affairs, but it's not the deepest truth about consciousness. The moksha medicine temporarily weakens the ego's grip, allowing you to experience consciousness in its wider, more fundamental forms. You realize that you are not just this isolated, separate self, but something much larger: consciousness itself, awareness itself, existence itself. This kind of talk would normally make Will roll his eyes. It sounds like mystical nonsense, the kind of thing that has no practical meaning or value. But there's something about the way Dr. Robert and Suzilla speak, the combination of intellectual rigor and evident personal experience, that makes Will listen more carefully than he otherwise might. The conversation turns to the specific ways the moksha medicine is used. Dr. Robert describes the coming-of-age ceremony, where young people typically around age 16 or 17 have their first moksha experience. It's a rite of passage, he explains, marking the transition from childhood to adult responsibility. The experience often gives young people a profound sense of meaning and connection, a direct experience of the sacred dimension of life. This inoculates them, in a way, against the cynicism and materialism that can lead people to waste their lives on shallow pursuits. Can't help but think how different this is from his own teenage years. The confusion, the rebellion, the lack of any meaningful coming-of-age ritual or guidance. He was thrown into adulthood with no preparation, no understanding of himself, no sense of deeper meaning or purpose. Suzilla describes the therapeutic use of the moksha medicine. Sometimes people are stuck in patterns that ordinary psychotherapy can't touch: deep trauma, rigid defenses, compulsive behaviors. The moksha medicine can sometimes break through these patterns, allowing people to see their lives from a completely different perspective. I've seen people work through issues in a single moksha session that might take years to address through regular therapy. She gives an example of a woman who had been sexually abused as a child and who carried deep shame and self-hatred as a result. Through moksha therapy, this woman was able to access compassion for herself, to see her younger self with love rather than blame, and to begin releasing the toxic emotions she had carried for decades. It doesn't fix everything instantly, Suzilla emphasizes. The moksha experience is just the beginning, but it can create an opening, a shift in perspective that makes further healing possible. The most controversial use of the moksha medicine, from Will's perspective, is the practice of giving it to elderly people as they approach death. Dr. Robert explains the rationale. Death is the ultimate loss of ego, the final dissolution of the separate self. For most people, this prospect is terrifying. But the moksha medicine can give people a direct experience of ego dissolution while they're still alive and healthy. They experience the boundaries of self dissolving, consciousness expanding beyond the personal, and they discover that this isn't terrifying at all. It's liberating, even blissful. Having had this experience, they're much less afraid of death when it actually comes. Will challenges this practice. Isn't that just drugging people to make them compliant with death? Shouldn't people fight to stay alive? Dr. Robert responds thoughtfully. There's a difference between acceptance and passivity. We don't discourage people from taking care of their health or from treating illness. But when death is truly inevitable, fighting against it just creates suffering. Acceptance isn't defeat, it's wisdom, and the moksha medicine can help people access that wisdom. The conversation also addresses the potential dangers and downsides of entheogenic use. Dr. Robert is frank about the risks. The experience can be overwhelming, even terrifying. If someone takes the medicine with a troubled mindset, in an unsafe setting, without proper guidance, it can be traumatic. We've had a few instances over the years where people had difficult experiences despite all our precautions. That's why we're so careful about preparation and why we only use the medicine in specific, controlled contexts. He also acknowledges that the moksha medicine is not for everyone. Some people, particularly those with certain mental health conditions or strong trauma histories, may not be good candidates for entheogenic experiences. And even among those who could benefit, not everyone chooses to use it. It's always voluntary, Dr. Robert emphasizes. No one is required to take the moksha medicine, not even for the coming-of-age ceremony. We encourage it, we think it's valuable, but the choice is always individual. Will finds himself fascinated despite his skepticism. Part of him wants to dismiss all of this as dangerous nonsense, but he can't quite do it. The Palanese clearly aren't a society of drugged-out zombies. They're functional, intelligent, productive people who seem remarkably happy and psychologically healthy. If the moksha medicine is producing these results, perhaps there's something to it after all. Toward the end of the conversation, Dr. Robert makes Will an unexpected offer. Would you be interested in trying the moksha medicine yourself? Not now, you'd need several days of preparation. But if you're going to be here for a while and you're genuinely interested in understanding Palan culture, there's no better way than to experience this directly. We could arrange it if you're willing. Will's first instinct is to refuse. His rational, skeptical mind recoils from the idea of taking a powerful psychedelic drug. What if he has a bad trip? What if it reveals things about himself he doesn't want to see? What if it changes him in ways he can't predict or control? But another part of him, a part that has been slowly awakening during his time on Pala, is curious. What would it be like to experience the kind of expanded consciousness Dr. Robert describes? What might he learn about himself in reality? I'll think about it, Will says, which is more openness than he expected from himself. Dr. Robert nods, smiling. Take all the time you need, there's no pressure, but the offer stands if you decide you're interested. That night, lying in bed in the guest house, Will thinks about the conversation. His mind is a tangle of skepticism, curiosity, and something that might be fear. He has spent his whole adult life maintaining strict control over his consciousness, using alcohol to numb difficult feelings, but always staying in the driver's seat, always maintaining his defended sense of who he is. The idea of voluntarily surrendering that control, even temporarily, is both terrifying and strangely appealing. He thinks about what Dr. Robert said about ego dissolution, about consciousness beyond the personal self. Part of him recognizes this as exactly what he needs, to see beyond the narrow, defended, cynical ego self he has constructed over decades. But part of him clings to that ego self, recognizing it as all he knows, all he is certain of. To let it go, even temporarily, feels like a kind of death. As he drifts toward sleep, a myna bird outside calls out its familiar refrain. Attention! Here and now, boys. Will finds himself smiling despite his confusion and anxiety. Even the birds are inviting him to wake up, to be present, to see clearly. Perhaps, he thinks, it's time to accept the invitation. Perhaps it's time to see what lies beyond the narrow prison of his defended consciousness. But that decision, he knows, will require more courage than he's sure he possesses. Chapter 6. Political Tensions and the Gathering Storm. As Will becomes more integrated into daily life on Pala, he also becomes increasingly aware of the political tensions that threaten the island's unique way of life. These tensions come into sharp focus when he is invited to meet with Murugan, the young Raja, and his mother, the Rani, at the palace. The palace itself is a modest structure by royal standards, elegant but not ostentatious, built of local wood and stone, with gardens and courtyards that blend harmoniously with the landscape. This modesty reflects Palin values. Leadership is seen as service rather than privilege, and the Raj's role is more symbolic and ceremonial than autocratic. Real power lies with the council, a body of elected representatives and appointed advisors who govern according to principles established in the written constitution created by Dr. Andrew MacPhail and the old Raja over a century ago. Murugan, now 18, is about to come of age and assume full authority as Raja. Will had met him briefly on the beach after the shipwreck, but this is his first extended encounter with the young ruler. Murugan is handsome, well-groomed, and clearly intelligent, but there's something about him that makes Will uneasy. His manner is smooth, almost slick, and his conversation is peppered with references to the outside world: London, New York, military academies, industrial development. He has clearly been educated abroad, at his mother's insistence, and that education seems to have alienated him from his own culture. The Rani is even more concerning. She is a formidable woman in her 50s, dressed in expensive clothing that seems out of place on Pala, her manner imperious and her eyes hard. She has converted to a fundamentalist form of Hinduism quite different from the syncretistic, non-dogmatic spiritual practices of traditional Palin culture. She speaks with fervent certainty about the need to purify Palin religion, to eliminate what she sees as dangerous and heretical practices, particularly the use of the moksha medicine and the integration of Buddhist and Tantric elements into spiritual life. During their conversation, it becomes clear to Will that both Murugan and the Rani have their own agendas, and neither agenda bodes well for traditional Palin society. Murugan has been dazzled by the power and glamour he's seen abroad: military parades, industrial might, nationalist fervor. He speaks with boyish enthusiasm about his friendship with Colonel Deepa, the military dictator of neighboring Rendang, who has promised to help modernize Pala once Murugan assumes full power. Colonel Deepa represents everything Pala has tried to avoid. He rules Rendang through military force, suppressing dissent, channeling resources into the military rather than education or health care, and promoting an aggressive nationalism that has made Rendang a threat to its neighbors. He is also in the pocket of various international oil companies and other industrial interests who want access to the region's resources. For Deepa, Pala represents an opportunity, small, weak, and sitting atop valuable oil reserves. The Rani's motivations are somewhat different but equally dangerous to Palin culture. She genuinely believes in her fundamentalist religious vision and sees herself as a reformer who will save Pala from spiritual corruption. She views the Palin emphasis on meditation, the body, sexuality, and individual spiritual experience as dangerous heresies that lead people away from proper devotion and religious authority. She wants to impose a more orthodox, hierarchical religious structure with clear doctrines and authority figures, specifically with herself as a kind of spiritual leader. As Will listens to them outline their plans for Pala's future, he experiences a mix of recognition and dismay. He recognizes the pattern because it's familiar from his work with aldehyde and other powerful interests: the combination of economic exploitation, military power, and religious or ideological justification for domination. It's the same pattern that has played out across the world for centuries, and now it's coming for Pala. Murugan explains, with disturbing naivete, how the development will work. Colonel Deepa's forces will provide security and technical assistance. Foreign oil companies will be granted exploration and drilling rights in exchange for royalties that will fund modernization, which apparently means military buildup, industrial development, and large-scale construction projects. The traditional economy based on small-scale agriculture and crafts will be transformed into a market-based industrial economy integrated into global capitalism. "We've been isolated too long," Murugan says earnestly. "We've been left behind while the rest of the world progresses. It's time for Pala to join the 20th century, to take its place among the nations of the world." He seems genuinely to believe that this transformation will benefit his people, that development and progress, as defined by Western industrial capitalism, are obviously good and desirable. The Rani adds her own vision of religious reform. She wants to eliminate the moksha medicine, which she considers a dangerous drug that leads to false spiritual experiences. She wants to end the Palin approach to sexuality, which she views as immoral licentiousness. She wants to reform education to include proper religious instruction and moral discipline. In her vision, Paula will become a devout, hierarchical society with clear moral rules and spiritual authorities, specifically, authorities who share her fundamentalist views. Will finds himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position during this conversation. On one level, this is exactly what he was sent to Paula to facilitate. Aldehyde wants access to the oil, and Murugan and the Rani are offering exactly that. If Will provides support, makes the right introductions, helps negotiate the deals, he will have accomplished his mission and will be rewarded accordingly. This is what he's good at, facilitating the kind of exploitation that masquerades as development, helping powerful interests get what they want while providing ideological cover. But something has changed in Will during his weeks on Paula. He has seen what this society is, what it has accomplished, what it represents. He has experienced genuine kindness, learned about alternative ways of living and being, formed real connections with people like Suzilla and Dr. Robert. The idea of helping to destroy all this for oil profits and geopolitical advantage suddenly seems not just wrong but obscene. Yet what choice does he have? If he doesn't help, Aldehyde will simply send someone else. The forces arrayed against Paula, international capital, military power, religious fundamentalism, are vast and powerful. The island's isolation, which has protected it for so long, now makes it vulnerable. It has few allies, little military capability, and limited ability to resist determined pressure from outside. After the meeting, Will has a conversation with Vijaya Bhattacharya, a young Palanese man who is a close friend of Dr. Robert and Suzilla. Vijaya is deeply concerned about the political situation. He explains that the council is debating how to respond to the gathering threat. Some members advocate for reaching out to international organizations, appealing for protection as a unique cultural heritage site. Others suggest trying to negotiate with DIPA and the external forces, offering limited concessions in exchange for preserving core Palan values and institutions. Still others argue for passive resistance, refusing to cooperate with any transformation imposed from outside, even if it means suffering consequences. The problem, Vijaya says, is that our principles constrain us. We believe in nonviolence, in respecting individual freedom, in education rather than coercion. These are beautiful principles, and they work wonderfully for creating a good society. But they leave us vulnerable to those who don't share those principles. We can't force Murugan to see wisdom when he comes of age. We can't prevent the Rani from pursuing her agenda. We can't defend ourselves militarily against Deepa. Our goodness, in a sense, makes us weak. We'll ask the obvious question, why don't you compromise? Give them some of what they want, limited oil development, some modernization, but maintain control over education, culture, the essential features of your society. Vijaya sighs. We've debated that. The problem is that once you open the door to that kind of development, it's very hard to control. The logic of industrial capitalism and military power is totalizing. It wants to transform everything according to its own imperatives. Give them the oil, and they'll want control over labor and wages. Give them that, and they'll want to reshape education to produce suitable workers. Give them that, and suddenly your whole society has been transformed into something unrecognizable. This conversation highlights one of the central tragedies of the novel. Wisdom and goodness may not be enough to survive in a world dominated by power and greed. Paula has created something precious and rare, but it cannot defend it against the forces now gathering. The very qualities that make Paula good, its nonviolence, its respect for freedom, its rejection of manipulative power, also make it vulnerable to destruction. That evening, Will joins Dr. Robert and several other Palanese leaders for dinner and conversation. The mood is somber but not despairing. These are people who have spent their lives cultivating equanimity and acceptance, and they face even this crisis with remarkable calm. But beneath the calm, Will can sense genuine grief and concern. Dr. Robert speaks about the situation with characteristic thoughtfulness. We always knew this might happen. Utopia is fragile, especially in a world dominated by very different values. We've had a good run, over a century of relative peace and genuine human flourishing. That's not nothing. We've proven that another way is possible. Even if Paula as a society ends, the ideas, the practices, the vision, these can survive and perhaps inspire others elsewhere. Another elder, a woman named Lakshmi, adds, the question has always been whether we can demonstrate the viability of our approach clearly enough that it spreads beyond this island. If Palin ideas influence thinking in other societies, if our experiments in education and sustainability and consciousness are studied and adapted elsewhere, then our work continues even if this particular society falls. This raises a question that has been nagging at Will. Why has Paula remained so isolated? If their approach is so successful, why haven't they tried to spread it, to influence other societies, to create a movement? Dr. Robert responds, "We've wrestled with that question for generations. The problem is that you can't export a culture the way you export commodities. What works here works because of a specific integration of history, geography, scale, and values. We're a small island with a relatively homogeneous population and a century of shared cultural evolution. Trying to impose our approach on societies with different histories and structures would be a form of cultural imperialism, which we reject." He continues, "Moreover, we've been aware that too much engagement with the outside world would transform us in unpredictable ways. To spread our ideas effectively, we'd need to become a political movement, to engage in the kind of power struggles and ideological conflicts that characterize international relations. And in doing so, we'd likely lose the very qualities we're trying to preserve. We chose isolation not from arrogance, but from a recognition that some things are too fragile to survive in the rough and tumble of global politics." This explanation makes sense to Will, but it also highlights the tragic bind Paula now finds itself in. By choosing isolation and purity, they've forgone the alliances and influence that might have protected them. They've created a beautiful garden, but gardens are vulnerable to storms, and a storm is coming. As the evening continues, the conversation turns to more personal reflections. Various people share their feelings about what's happening. Some express anger at Murugan and the Rani for betraying their culture. Others express sadness at the likely loss of their way of life. Still others maintain equanimity, seeing even this potential tragedy as part of the larger flow of existence. Things arise and pass away, including societies and civilizations. Will is struck by the range of responses, all apparently acceptable within Palin culture. There is no insistence on any single correct emotional stance. People are allowed to be angry or sad or accepting, to fight or to surrender, to hope or to despair. This emotional flexibility, he realizes, is another aspect of Palin wisdom, the recognition that there are many valid ways to respond to difficulty and that different people at different times will find different responses appropriate. Late in the evening, after most people have left, Will finds himself alone with Dr. Robert on the veranda. The old doctor is looking up at the stars, and there's a sadness in his expression that Will hasn't seen before. "Do you really think it's all going to end?" Will asks. Dr. Robert is silent for a long moment before responding. "Probably, yes. Maybe not immediately, but within a few years at most. Murugan will invite Deepa in, oil development will begin, traditional structures will be dismantled, and Paula will become just another struggling country trying to navigate the global economy. The unique culture we've built over 5 generations will likely not survive." "How can you be so calm about it?" Will asks, genuinely puzzled. Dr. Robert smiles slightly. "I'm not as calm as I appear. Inside, there's grief, there's anger, there's fear. But I've spent 60 years learning to hold difficult emotions without being controlled by them. I can feel grief and still maintain perspective. I can feel anger and still act with wisdom. I can feel fear and still maintain presence." He pauses, then continues. "But beyond that, I genuinely don't know if fighting desperately to preserve Paula is the right thing to do. Perhaps our time is over. Perhaps we've demonstrated what we needed to demonstrate. Perhaps the future belongs to different experiments, different approaches. I trust the larger process, even when I can't see where it's leading." This level of equanimity in the face of catastrophe is both inspiring and frustrating to Will. Part of him admires it. This is the kind of wisdom and acceptance he has glimpsed possibilities of but has never achieved. But another part of him wants to shake Dr. Robert, to demand that he fight, that he not give up so easily on something so valuable. "But don't you have an obligation to try?" Will presses. "Even if you fail, don't you have to resist?" Dr. Robert nods thoughtfully. "Yes, we do, and we will. We'll speak truth to power. We'll educate anyone willing to listen. We'll resist non-violently if we can. But we won't compromise our principles to preserve our society. We won't use violence to defend nonviolence. We won't manipulate and deceive to preserve a culture built on honesty and transparency. We'll do what we can, and we'll accept what comes." This conversation crystallizes something for Will. The The Palanese are not passive or naive. They understand perfectly well what's happening to them and why. But they're choosing to respond according to their values rather than abandoning those values in a desperate attempt at self-preservation. It's a kind of heroism that Will has never encountered before, the courage to maintain integrity even when doing so leads to defeat. As Will walks back to the guest house that night, his mind is churning. The political situation on Paula is clarifying his own moral choices. He can continue with his mission, helping to facilitate the destruction of something precious and rare, or he can refuse, knowing that his refusal probably won't change the outcome, but at least won't make him complicit in what's coming. The choice should be clear, but it's not. Will's whole life has been built on cynical pragmatism, on doing what benefits him regardless of broader consequences. To change that now, to choose integrity over self-interest, would require a fundamental transformation of who he is. And yet, something is changing in Will. His time on Paula, his conversations with Suzilla and Dr. Robert, his observations of Palan life, all of this is working on him, creating cracks in his defensive armor, letting in light and possibility. He is not yet transformed, but he is no longer the same person who washed up on Paula's shore. The question is whether the transformation will go deep enough, fast enough, to change his choices when the moment of decision comes. Chapter 7. Sexuality, Tantra, and the Body. One morning, Suzilla invites Will to observe a session at what the Palanese call a love and yoga class, part of the educational system for older adolescents and young adults. Will accepts, curious but also somewhat apprehensive. He expects either repressive moralizing or the kind of shallow sexual liberation that he's observed in parts of Western counterculture. Sex as mere recreation, stripped of emotional or spiritual significance. What he encounters is neither. The class takes place in a spacious, beautiful room with high ceilings, open to the garden on one side. About 15 young people, ranging in age from perhaps 16 to early 20s, are gathered with their instructor, a woman named Radha who is perhaps 50, still physically graceful and radiating a kind of serene vitality. The students are sitting in a circle, and as Will and Suzilla settle quietly in the back to observe, Radha is leading a discussion about what she calls conscious loving. The body, Radha is saying, is not separate from the spirit. This is one of the fundamental errors of Western thought, the division between body and soul, flesh and spirit, material and transcendent. In tantric teaching, which has been integrated into our approach, the body is understood as a manifestation of consciousness, and sexuality as a form of sacred energy that can be refined and transformed. She continues, but this doesn't mean all sexual activity is automatically sacred or spiritual. It depends on how you engage with it. Sex can be sacred, or it can be merely mechanical. It can express love and connection, or it can be a form of mutual exploitation. It can integrate body, heart, and spirit, or it can fragment and diminish you. The question is not whether to be sexual, that's a natural part of being human, but how to be sexual in ways that enhance rather than diminish your life. The students ask questions, and Radha responds with a combination of theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. One young woman asks how you know if a sexual relationship is healthy or not. Radha responds, ask yourself a few questions. Does this relationship make you feel more alive, more open, more yourself? Or does it make you feel contracted, secretive, ashamed? Are you able to be fully present, or do you find yourself escaping into fantasy or numbness? Does the relationship involve genuine mutual respect and care, or is there exploitation, manipulation, or coercion? Are you growing through this relationship, learning about yourself and the other person, or are you repeating the same patterns over and over? She emphasizes that these questions aren't meant to produce guilt or anxiety, but to develop what she calls erotic intelligence, the ability to navigate sexuality with awareness, discernment, and responsibility. The goal is not to restrict sexuality, but to make it richer, deeper, more meaningful. The class then moves into practical exercises. Radha guides the students through a series of partner yoga postures that develop body awareness, coordination, and trust. The partners, some mixed gender, some same gender, work together to support each other in various balancing poses. Will notices the ease and comfort the students have with physical contact, the absence of the awkwardness and self-consciousness that would characterize a similar exercise in his culture. Next, Radha introduces breathing exercises designed to increase awareness of sexual energy in the body. She explains, what you call sexual energy is really just life energy, vitality, concentrated in particular ways. By learning to breathe consciously, to direct attention to different parts of the body, you can learn to work with this energy rather than being controlled by it. You can learn to refine it, to circulate it throughout your body, to use it not just for genital pleasure, but for overall vitality and even spiritual awakening. The students practice breathing patterns that Radha calls pranayama, controlled breathing techniques from yoga. She explains how certain patterns of breath can increase arousal while others can calm it, how awareness of breath during sexual activity can deepen pleasure and presence. This is completely foreign to Will's experience of sexuality, which has always been driven by urgency and need, by a desire for release and momentary oblivion rather than presence and awareness. After the breathing exercises, Radha leads the class in what she calls a loving awareness meditation. The students pair up and sit facing each other, maintaining eye contact while breathing together. The instruction is simple. Look at your partner with genuine seeing, without projection or judgment, simply observing what's actually there. Notice when your mind wanders into fantasy or evaluation and return to direct seeing. Notice your own reactions: attraction, aversion, boredom, curiosity. Without acting on them, simply observing them as passing phenomena. Will finds this exercise almost unbearably intimate to watch. The students are engaged in something far more vulnerable and connecting than mere physical contact would be. To really see and be seen, to maintain presence and awareness in connection with another, this strikes Will as both beautiful and terrifying. It's exactly what he has avoided his entire adult life, the kind of real intimacy that requires dropping defenses and being genuinely present. After the meditation, Radha leads a discussion about what the students experienced. They speak with remarkable emotional articulation about feelings that arose: vulnerability, self-consciousness, tenderness, fear, attraction. Radha helps them understand these experiences in the context of the broader teaching. What you're learning, she explains, is that real intimacy requires presence. It requires being willing to be seen, not just your body but your whole self. And it requires being willing to really see another person, not just your projections and fantasies about them, but who they actually are. The class concludes with Radha offering some reflections on the ethics of sexuality in Palin culture. She emphasizes the absolute importance of consent, not just formal agreement, but ongoing, enthusiastic consent based on clear communication. She talks about the responsibility that comes with sexual relationships, the need to be honest, to care about your partner's well-being, to avoid causing harm. She speaks about the integration of sexuality with other dimensions of life, how sexual health connects to emotional health, to physical health, to spiritual practice, to ethical living. As Will and Suzilla walk back after the class, Will is full of questions and reactions. Is that kind of teaching normal here? He asks. Do all young people go through this? Suzilla nods. Pretty much. The specifics vary, different teachers have different styles and emphases, but the basic approach is standard. By the time young people become sexually active, which is usually around 16 or 17, they've had years of education about anatomy, reproduction, consent, and relationship dynamics. And the education continues. These classes are available throughout adulthood for people who want to deepen their understanding or work through issues. Will expresses his amazement at the sophistication of the approach. In my culture, he says, sex education is either non-existent or purely biological, facts about reproduction and disease prevention, with maybe some stern warnings about pregnancy. There's nothing about pleasure, nothing about emotion, nothing about consciousness or spirituality, and certainly nothing like what I just saw, practical training in how to be present and aware during intimacy. Suzilla smiles. Well, we've found that approach to be much more effective. When young people understand sexuality in this holistic way, when they have tools for being present and communicating clearly, sexual relationships tend to be much healthier. We have very low rates of sexual violence, unplanned pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections. Not because we suppress sexuality, but because we educate people thoroughly and help them develop wisdom about it. The conversation turns to Will's own sexual history, which he finds himself sharing with unusual openness. He describes his relationship with Molly, how sexuality between them had become mechanical and disconnected, a site of mutual manipulation rather than genuine connection. How he had been unfaithful more out of revenge and the need to prove something to himself than from any real desire. How sex for him had become associated with conquest, escape, and the temporary relief of anxiety rather than with pleasure, connection, or joy. Suzilla listens without judgment. That's what happens, she says gently, when sexuality is split off from the rest of life, when it's not integrated with emotional intimacy, ethical awareness, and spiritual consciousness. It becomes compulsive, driven, unsatisfying. People use each other as objects for gratification rather than truly meeting as whole human beings. And then they wonder why sexual relationships are so often disappointing and painful. She adds, the tantric approach, which has influenced our education, is based on the understanding that sexuality is a form of energy that can be destructive or creative depending on how you work with it. Unintegrated, unconscious sexuality tends to be fragmenting and degrading, but conscious, integrated sexuality can be incredibly healing and transformative. It can teach you about presence, about love, about the transcendence of ordinary ego boundaries. It can be, in the deepest sense, a spiritual practice. This conversation stirs something deep in Will, a longing for the kind of sexual experience Suzilla describes, which he has never had. All his sexual encounters have been variations on the same theme: urgent, disconnected, using the other person to fill some void or prove something to himself, achieving temporary release but never genuine satisfaction or connection. The idea that sexuality could be different, conscious, present, integrative, even sacred, is both appealing and frightening. Will finds himself imagining being sexual with Suzilla, and the thought has a different quality than his usual sexual fantasies. It's not primarily about conquest or need, but about genuine curiosity and desire for connection. He wonders what it would be like to really see and be seen, to be present rather than performing, to experience sexuality as the kind of integrated practice Radha described. But he also recognizes that he has no idea how to do that his conditioning runs deep, that transformation in this area would require profound relearning. Later, Will reflects on another aspect of Palan sexuality that Suzilla mentioned in passing: the acceptance of sexual diversity. The Palanese, she explained, don't categorize people as strictly heterosexual or homosexual. Sexual orientation is understood as fluid for many people, and there's no stigma attached to same-sex relationships or to people whose desires don't fit conventional categories. What matters is not who you're attracted to, but whether your relationships are based on mutual respect, genuine connection, and ethical integrity. This acceptance flows naturally from the Palan emphasis on observation without judgment. If you train people from childhood to observe their own experience without imposing rigid categories or moral judgments, they naturally develop a more flexible and accepting attitude toward human diversity in all its forms. The result is a society with remarkably little sexual anxiety, guilt, or violence, a society where people can explore and express their sexuality in ways that enhance rather than diminish their lives. For Will, this represents yet another challenge to his assumptions. He has always thought of his own cultural attitudes toward sexuality, the repression, the double standards, the compartmentalization, as simply normal. To see a completely different approach working successfully forces him to question whether the sexual misery so common in his society is really inevitable, or whether it's the product of particularly unhealthy cultural attitudes that could be changed. Chapter 8. Economics, Ecology, and the Politics of Enough. Will's education about Palan society continues with a visit to an agricultural collective and conversations about the island's economic system. He is accompanied by Vijaya, who works as both an agronomist and a teacher of what the Palanese call applied ecology. As they walk through terraced rice paddies, Vijaya explains the principles underlying Palan agriculture and economics. The first principle, he explains, is sustainability, not as a buzzword but as a concrete commitment. We recognize that we live on a finite island with finite resources, Vijaya says. There's no possibility of endless growth, no frontier to expand into. So from the beginning, our ancestors asked, how many people can this land support sustainably? What practices will allow us to live here indefinitely without degrading the environment that sustains us? The answer they arrived at involved a combination of strategies. First, population control, not through coercion, but through education and the availability of effective contraception. Palanese families tend to be small, typically 2 or 3 children, because that's what makes sense given the island's carrying capacity. This is a choice made by individuals and families, but it's an informed choice based on understanding of ecological limits. Second, agricultural practices designed for long-term sustainability rather than short-term yield maximization. We'll observe sophisticated terracing that prevents soil erosion, crop rotation systems that maintain soil fertility, integrated pest management that minimizes chemical inputs, and water management systems that conserve this precious resource. Every technique we use, Vijaya explains, is evaluated by a simple question: can we do this indefinitely? If a practice would eventually exhaust the soil or pollute the water or destroy the forest, we don't do it, no matter how profitable it might be in the short term. Third, an economic system that doesn't rely on continuous growth. Vijaya explains that this is perhaps the most radical aspect of Palin economics and the hardest for outsiders to understand. In your world, he says to Will, the economy is expected to grow every year. If it's not growing, that's considered a crisis. But growth on a finite planet is impossible indefinitely. Eventually, you hit ecological limits. We've chosen to create a steady-state economy, one that provides everyone with a decent standard of living but doesn't need to expand continuously. Will challenges this. But without growth, how do you improve living standards? How do you create opportunities for young people? How do you have hope for the future? Vijaya's response is thoughtful. We've redefined what improvement means. Instead of constantly increasing material consumption, we focus on improving quality of life through better education, healthier relationships, deeper spiritual understanding, more beautiful art and music, more ecological health. These things can improve indefinitely without requiring more resources. He continues, as for opportunities for young people, everyone has meaningful work that contributes to the community and that they find satisfying. We don't have unemployment because we're not constantly automating jobs to increase profits. We use technology selectively to reduce drudgery and enhance quality of life, but not to eliminate human involvement in productive activity. And hope for the future doesn't depend on having more stuff. It depends on knowing you're part of a sustainable way of life that can continue for generations. This economic philosophy is implemented through a system that blends private enterprise, cooperative ownership, and community resources. Small businesses exist, craft workshops, restaurants, services, but they're small-scale and oriented toward community needs rather than growth and profit maximization. Larger enterprises, like the agricultural collective they're visiting, are owned cooperatively by the workers. And certain resources, the land itself, water, forests, education, healthcare, are considered commons, belonging to the community as a whole and managed for the benefit of all. The result is a society with no extreme poverty and no extreme wealth. Everyone has access to the basics: food, shelter, education, healthcare, as a matter of right. Beyond that, people's material circumstances vary based on their choices and efforts, but the variation is modest. There are no billionaires on Pala, but there are also no homeless people, no one going hungry, no one denied education or medical care. Will finds this both admirable and troubling. The admirable part is obvious. This is a society that has solved the material problems that plague much of the world, but he worries about what might be lost. Don't you lose innovation and dynamism? He asks. Isn't competition necessary to drive progress? Vijaya smiles. Competition for what? We're not trying to dominate other nations, corner markets, or accumulate vast wealth. We're trying to live well sustainably on this island. For that goal, cooperation is far more effective than competition. He adds, as for innovation, we have plenty of it, but it's directed toward different goals than in your society. We innovate in education, in agriculture, in healthcare, in spiritual practice, in art and music. We've developed techniques for living that are, in their own way, as sophisticated as your technology. It's just a different kind of sophistication, oriented toward human flourishing and ecological sustainability rather than toward power and profit. The conversation turns to the oil reserves under Pala, the resource that has attracted outside interest. Vijaya's face darkens. We know it's there, he says. We've known for decades, and we've chosen not to exploit it because we understand what would follow. Oil development would require massive infrastructure: wells, refineries, pipelines, ports. It would bring in foreign workers and companies. It would generate revenues that would create new inequalities. It would tie us into the global economy and make us dependent on factors beyond our control. Most fundamentally, it would change what we are, from a sustainable local economy to an extraction economy, from a culture oriented toward living well to one oriented toward profit. But, Will points out, playing devil's advocate, the revenues from oil could fund development, better hospitals, more schools, modern infrastructure. Vijaya shakes his head. We already have good hospitals and schools and infrastructure appropriate to our scale and needs. The development oil money would bring isn't development in any meaningful sense. It's transformation into a different kind of society, one more like yours. And we've seen what your kind of society produces: environmental destruction, social fragmentation, chronic unhappiness despite material abundance. Why would we want that? This conversation illuminates something Will has been struggling to understand: why the Palanese don't want what seems obviously desirable from an outside perspective. The answer is that they're starting from completely different premises about what constitutes the good life and what represents genuine progress. From their perspective, industrial development represents not advancement, but degradation. A move away from sustainable, meaningful, connected living toward unsustainable, meaningless, fragmented existence. Will spends the afternoon learning about specific ecological practices. He observes composting systems that return nutrients to the soil, water conservation techniques that maintain the health of streams and watersheds, forestry practices that harvest wood sustainably while maintaining biodiversity. He learns about the Palanese understanding of ecology as a web of relationships where everything is connected. Human well-being depends on healthy ecosystems. Healthy ecosystems depend on thoughtful human stewardship. Thoughtful stewardship depends on education and awareness. Later, over dinner at the Agricultural Collective, Will meets farmers and workers who speak with obvious pride and satisfaction about their work. They're not wage laborers performing alienated work for someone else's profit. They're members of a cooperative, participating in decisions about what to grow and how to grow it, sharing in both the work and the rewards. Their relationship to the land is not exploitative but reciprocal. They care for it, and it sustains them. One older man, speaking with evident emotion, explains, "This land has been in my family for 6 generations. My great-great-grandfather helped terrace these hillsides. My grandfather planted these fruit trees. My father taught me the crop rotations we still use. And someday, I'll teach my grandchildren, and they'll teach their children. We're not just farming this land, we're caring for it, knowing that our descendants will depend on it. That gives meaning to the work that no amount of profit could provide." This intergenerational perspective is another key to Palan sustainability. Because families expect to remain on the same land for generations, they have powerful incentives to maintain its productivity and health. The tragedy of the commons, where shared resources get depleted because no one has an individual stake in their preservation, is avoided through a combination of communal ownership and long-term family involvement. People care for the land not just because they own it legally, but because they are in relationship with it across generations. As the evening concludes and Will walks back with Vijaya, he finds himself deeply moved by what he's witnessed. There's something profoundly sane about the Palan approach: recognizing limits, living within them, orienting the economy toward genuine human needs rather than abstract growth. It's the opposite of the frontier mentality and growth-at-all-costs attitude that dominates the world Will comes from. But he also sees the fragility of this system. It works on a small island with a relatively homogeneous culture and a long tradition of cooperative values. Could it scale? Could it work in larger, more diverse societies? Could it resist the pressures of global capitalism and the seductions of consumerism? These questions have no clear answers, and that uncertainty underscores the tragedy of what's about to happen to Pala. Just as this experiment in sustainable living is proving its viability, it's about to be destroyed by forces that can't imagine any alternative to endless growth and resource exploitation. Chapter 9. Death, Dying, and the Final Liberation. Will's time on Pala takes a profound turn when Lakshmi, an elderly woman whom he has come to know through his association with Dr. Robert's family, is dying. Suzilla asks if Will would like to be present for Lakshmi's death, explaining that attending a conscious death is considered an important spiritual experience and teaching opportunity in Palan culture. Will is apprehensive. Death makes him uncomfortable, recalling his failure to be present for Molly's dying, but he agrees, sensing that this is an important part of understanding Palan life. Lakshmi is 86 years old and dying of what appears to be cancer, though she has refused aggressive treatment, choosing instead what the Palanese call conscious dying. She's being cared for in her own home, surrounded by family and friends. When Will and Suzilla arrive, the atmosphere is surprisingly peaceful, sad but not desperate, serious but not grim. Lakshmi is in bed, propped up with pillows, still conscious though clearly weak. Her eyes are bright with intelligence and presence despite her body's deterioration. The room has been arranged thoughtfully, beautiful flowers, soft music playing quietly, incense burning. Family members sit nearby, sometimes speaking softly with Lakshmi, sometimes sitting in meditative silence. A younger woman is reading from what one learns is the Palan version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a text adapted from Buddhist sources that provides guidance for the dying person. Dr. Robert is present, periodically checking Lakshmi's condition and administering pain medication as needed. But his role is not to fight death or to prolong life at all costs. It's to help Lakshmi remain as conscious and comfortable as possible during her transition. He explains to Will, the Western medical model treats death as the enemy, as failure. We'll pump people full of drugs, hook them up to machines, subject them to procedures that may prolong life but diminish its quality, all to delay the inevitable. Here, we accept that death comes to everyone, and we focus on helping people die well, consciously, with dignity and acceptance. As Will observes, various people come and go, family members saying goodbye, friends offering love and gratitude, even children who are brought in to see Lakshmi and say farewell. The children are not shielded from death, but included in this final passage. They're sad but not traumatized, understanding death as a natural part of life. This openness with children reflects the Palan philosophy of not hiding difficult realities, but helping people develop the capacity to face them with awareness and equanimity. Lakshmi herself is remarkable. Despite her pain and weakness, she is present, engaged, even occasionally humorous. She speaks with people about her life, shares memories, expresses love and gratitude. She also speaks about dying itself, describing her experiences and perceptions as death approaches. "I'm not afraid," she says at one point. "I've practiced for this moment my whole life. I know that what I am is not this body, not this personality. These will dissolve, but consciousness itself continues. I'm returning to the source, like a wave returning to the ocean." This articulation of non-dual consciousness, the understanding that individual identity is a temporary construct within a larger field of awareness, is central to Palan spirituality. It's based on Buddhist and Hindu teachings, but has been integrated into a perspective that doesn't require belief in specific doctrines. What matters is the direct experience of consciousness beyond ego, which many Palanese have accessed through meditation and moksha medicine experiences. As the hours pass, Lakshmi's condition gradually deteriorates. She drifts in and out of clear consciousness, but even in her confusion, there's a quality of acceptance and peace. Dr. Robert and Suzilla guide her through various practices, breath awareness, visualization, mantras, designed to help maintain consciousness as long as possible and to facilitate a peaceful transition when it comes. At one point, Lakshmi asks for the moksha medicine, which has been prepared for this possibility. After taking a small dose, she experiences a period of enhanced clarity and presence. Her eyes open wide, and she speaks with lucidity about what she's experiencing. "It's so beautiful," she says. "Everything is light, everything is love. I see now that there was nothing to fear ever. Death is not ending but opening, not loss but liberation." For perhaps an hour, she is radiant, despite her dying body, speaking words of wisdom and love to those gathered around her. As the medicine wears off, Lakshmi becomes quieter, more internal. The reader continues to read from the death text, offering guidance. "Let go of attachment to this body, this personality, this life. These are not what you truly are. You are consciousness itself, awareness itself, the light of knowing. As the body fails, remain aware. As thoughts dissolve, remain aware. Let go into the spacious awareness that is your true nature." Finally, as evening approaches, Lakshmi's breathing becomes more labored and then quieter. The room falls into deep silence, everyone present in meditation. Lakshmi takes a few more breaths, then exhales one final time and is still. There is no frantic rush for medical intervention, no denial of what's happening. Simply presence, acceptance, and a quality of sacred witnessing. In the moments after Lakshmi's death, the family and friends sit in continued meditation, creating what they believe is a supportive energetic field for the departing consciousness. Then they begin to speak about Lakshmi, sharing stories, expressing gratitude, celebrating her life. There are tears, but they are tears of love and loss, not of bitterness or despair. Will is profoundly moved by what he's witnessed. This is death as he has never seen it, not hidden away in hospitals, not fought against with desperate futility, but met consciously, with acceptance and even grace. Lakshmi's death was not a defeat but a culmination, the final act of a life well lived and consciously engaged. The contrast with Molly's death, morphine-induced unconsciousness, denial, isolation, fear, could not be more stark. After the gathering, as Will and Suzilla walk back in the darkness, Will tries to articulate what he's feeling. "I don't know how to make sense of what I just experienced," he says. "It was sad. Watching someone die is sad. But it wasn't horrible. It was actually beautiful in a way I can't quite explain." Lakshmi seemed more present, more alive in her dying than most people I know are in their living. Suzilla nods. That's what conscious dying looks like, and it's only possible because Lakshmi spent her whole life preparing for it, practicing meditation, working through fear, cultivating acceptance and equanimity. Death wasn't something alien and terrifying that happened to her. It was the final practice, the ultimate letting go. Will asks about the moksha medicine and its role in dying. Suzilla explains that it's offered but not required for those approaching death. Some people have already done enough inner work that they don't need it. But for others, especially those who have been unable to overcome fear of death, the medicine can provide a direct experience of consciousness beyond ego, of the continuity of awareness beyond the death of the body. That experience can transform terror into acceptance. The conversation turns to Will's own fears about death. He confesses that he has spent most of his adult life avoiding thoughts about mortality, using various forms of distraction and denial to keep existential anxiety at bay. "I'm terrified of death," he admits. "I always have been. Not just the pain or the loss of control, but the complete annihilation, the ending of everything I am." Suzilla's response is gentle but challenging. "But you don't know that death is annihilation. That's just an assumption and probably an incorrect one. Even from a purely scientific perspective, consciousness is mysterious. We don't understand it, don't know where it comes from, or what it truly is. The idea that it simply ends when the brain stops is a materialist assumption, not a proven fact, and certainly not one supported by the experiences of many people who have had near-death experiences or deep mystical states." She continues, "But more importantly, whether consciousness continues in some form after death or not, you can learn to be less identified with the ego self that feels so afraid. When you realize through direct experience that you are not just your thoughts, your personality, your body, but something larger, awareness itself, consciousness itself, then death becomes less frightening. What dies is the ego construct, the small self. But the awareness that experiences the ego doesn't die, it simply moves on to other forms, other experiences." This is obviously beyond Will's current understanding and experience, but he's no longer dismissing such talk as mere mystical nonsense. He's seen too much on Pala, including Lakshmi's conscious death, to maintain his materialist certainty. Something more is happening than his philosophical framework can account for. As they arrive back at Dr. Roberts' compound, Will feels exhausted but also strangely opened. Witnessing Lakshmi's death has cracked something in him, some defended place where he keeps his own mortality at bay. He cannot return to his former state of unconscious denial. Death is real, it is coming for him as it comes for everyone, and the question of how he will meet it has suddenly become urgent. That night, unable to sleep, Will sits on the veranda looking up at the stars. He thinks about Lakshmi's final words. "Everything is light, everything is love. I see now that there was nothing to fear, ever." Can that possibly be true, or was it just the medicine talking? But even as Will formulates this skeptical interpretation, he knows it's inadequate. Lakshmi's peace wasn't just in those final hours under the influence of the moksha medicine. It had characterized her whole approach to dying, the acceptance, the lack of bitterness, the continued engagement with life even as life was ending. That required a lifetime of cultivation. Will realizes that he wants what Lakshmi had, not the particular beliefs or doctrines, but the capacity to face death with equanimity and acceptance. He wants to live in a way that makes dying well possible. And that, he understands, would require him to change almost everything about how he has been living. Chapter 10. Will's Crisis and Therapeutic Breakthrough. The day after Lakshmi's death, Will finds himself in a state of internal crisis. The accumulation of experiences on Pala, the education system, the approach to sexuality, the ecological wisdom, the conscious dying, and above all, his developing relationship with Suzilla, has created an unbearable cognitive dissonance. He can no longer maintain his cynical worldview, yet he also cannot quite let go of the defensive structures he has built over a lifetime. Will's turmoil manifests physically. His shoulder, which had been healing well, flares up with pain. He has trouble sleeping, experiences anxiety attacks, and finds himself irritable and scattered. Suzilla, observing his condition with the practiced eye of a therapist, offers to work with him using Palin therapeutic techniques. Will's first impulse is to refuse. Therapy feels like weakness, like admitting defeat. But the pain and confusion are becoming unbearable, and some part of him recognizes that he needs help. They begin with what Suzilla calls body awareness work. She guides Will through a systematic scan of his body, asking him to notice tension, pain, and blocked energy. As he does this, Will becomes aware of just how much physical holding and armoring he carries: tension in his jaw, tightness in his chest, chronic contraction in his belly. These aren't just physical symptoms, Suzilla explains. They're where you hold your emotions, your unprocessed experiences, your defended places. The body keeps the score. Everything you've been avoiding shows up as physical tension and pain. Through gentle questioning and guided awareness, Suzilla helps Will begin to explore what's underneath the physical holding. The tight chest is connected to grief, for Molly, for his parents who died when he was young, for his own lost innocence. The belly contraction relates to fear of vulnerability, of being hurt, of losing control. The jaw tension is anger, at his Aunt Mary, at Molly, at himself, at the world. As these connections become conscious, emotions begin to surface. Will feels waves of grief, anger, and fear moving through his body. Suzilla guides him to stay present with these feelings rather than pushing them away or getting lost in stories about them. Just feel, she instructs. Don't analyze, don't justify, don't escape. Just feel the feelings fully, allow them to move through you. This is extraordinarily difficult for Will. His entire adult coping strategy has been based on not feeling, on thinking his way around emotions, on using cynicism and intellectualization as defenses against direct experience. To simply feel without those defenses is terrifying. But with Suzilla's steady presence and gentle encouragement, he begins to allow it. The session becomes intense when Suzilla asks Will to talk about his Aunt Mary, who raised him after his parents' death. The memory is still painful decades later. Mary was a religious fundamentalist, cold and controlling, who used her faith as a weapon to shame and dominate Will. She told him his natural impulses were sinful, his desires were wicked, his very existence was a burden she bore out of Christian duty. She never showed him physical affection, never praised him, never allowed him to simply be a child. As Will describes this, his voice becomes tight with emotion. She made me feel like there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Like I was bad, unlovable, a problem to be corrected rather than a person to be cherished, and I believed her. Part of me still believes her. Suzilla's response is direct and compassionate. But it wasn't true. You weren't bad or unlovable. You were a child who needed love and care, and instead you got rejection and control. That's not about you, it's about her incapacity. But you internalized her judgment, and you've been living with that toxic story about yourself ever since. This observation cuts through Will's defenses. Tears come, not the brief crying he experienced by the stream days earlier, but deep, wrenching sobs that seem to come from some buried place in his core. He cries for the child he was, who needed love and got cruelty. He cries for all the years he's lived cut off from his own heart, defended and alone. He cries for the life he might have lived if things had been different. Suzilla sits with him, occasionally touching his shoulder or hand, providing grounded presence without trying to fix or comfort away his pain. This, Will realizes even through his tears, is what he needed all along, someone to simply be with him in his suffering without needing it to be different. When the storm of emotion subsides, Will feels lighter but also raw and vulnerable. They take a break and walk in the garden. As they walk in silence, Will gradually comes back into his body, feeling the breeze, hearing the birds, seeing the flowers. The world seems more vivid, more present. His defenses are down, and without them, reality comes through more directly. After a while, Suzilla begins to speak about what happened. What you just experienced is what we call emotional release or catharsis. You accessed and expressed feelings that have been held in your body for decades. That's valuable and necessary. But it's only the beginning. Now comes the work of reinterpreting your story, of developing new patterns, of learning to live differently. She explains that the child Will was internalized his aunt's judgment as a survival strategy. When a child is dependent on a caretaker who is critical and rejecting, the child cannot afford to conclude that the caretaker is wrong. That would be too threatening. Instead, they conclude that they themselves are wrong, bad, unlovable. But now you're an adult, Suzilla says, And you don't need that survival strategy anymore. You can see that your aunt was limited, damaged by her own history and beliefs, unable to give you what you needed. That's sad, but it's not your fault. And more importantly, it doesn't define you. You can develop a new story about who you are, based on reality rather than on her twisted judgments. This reframing is revolutionary for Will. For the first time, he considers that maybe he isn't fundamentally flawed or unlovable. Maybe the problem was never him, but rather the environment he grew up in. Over the next few days, the therapeutic work continues. Suzilla guides Will through exercises in self-compassion, helping him develop the capacity to treat himself with the kindness he never received as a child. They work on identifying and challenging the automatic negative thoughts and beliefs that run underneath his conscious awareness. They also work with what Suzilla calls reparenting, helping Will give to himself what he didn't get as a child. In visualization exercises, Will imagines meeting his child self and offering that child the love, acceptance, and validation he needed. This feels awkward at first, but gradually something shifts. Will begins to access a tender protectiveness toward his younger self, a genuine compassion for that vulnerable child who suffered so much. Perhaps most importantly, Suzilla introduces Will to meditation practice, not just as an abstract technique, but as a practical tool for working with his mind. She teaches him to observe his thoughts without believing them, to notice when he's getting caught in stories and return to direct experience, to create space between stimulus and response so he can choose how to act. The meditation is simple but not easy. Sitting quietly, observing his breath, noticing when his mind wanders and gently returning attention to the present moment, Will quickly discovers how undisciplined and chaotic his mind is. Thoughts arise constantly, memories, plans, judgments, fantasies. That's normal, Suzilla assures him. Everyone's mind is like that at first. The point isn't to stop thinking, but to develop a different relationship with thought. Instead of being lost in thoughts, believing them automatically, you learn to observe them with some distance. You realize you are not your thoughts, you are the awareness that experiences thoughts. Through daily practice, Will begins to develop this capacity for meta-awareness. He starts to notice patterns, how anxiety spirals begin with a worried thought that he then elaborates into a catastrophic scenario, how depression follows from rigid thinking about himself and the world, how his defensive cynicism is actually a protection against vulnerability. Seeing these patterns doesn't immediately change them, but it's the beginning of change. You can't shift what you don't see. By bringing unconscious patterns into consciousness, Will creates the possibility of choosing different responses. This psychological and spiritual work brings Will to a crucial decision point regarding his mission on Paula. He can no longer pretend to himself that helping Aldehyde exploit the island is morally acceptable or consistent with who he wants to become. The Palanese have shown him extraordinary kindness, have shared their wisdom freely, have helped him begin to heal wounds he didn't even know he carried. To betray them for money and career advancement would be to betray himself. But what are his alternatives? If he refuses to cooperate with Aldehyde, he will have burned his bridges, no job, no prospects, perhaps even legal consequences. He would be choosing uncertainty and possible hardship over security and comfort. Moreover, his refusal probably wouldn't save Paula anyway. Aldehyde would simply send someone else. Yet Will knows, with a certainty he hasn't felt about anything in years, that he cannot continue on his previous path. Something has shifted fundamentally inside him. The therapy work with Suzilla, the meditation practice, the accumulated experiences on Paula, all of this has created a transformation that makes his old way of being impossible to sustain. One evening, sitting with Suzilla on the veranda after a meditation session, Will shares his dilemma. She listens thoughtfully, then responds. The question isn't whether your choice will save Paula. You can't control that outcome. The question is who you want to be, what you want to stand for. Do you want to be someone who betrays people who have shown you kindness? Or do you want to be someone who acts with integrity, regardless of the consequences? She continues. One of the key insights of Buddhist ethics is that what matters most is not the outcome of your actions, which you often can't control, but the intention and quality of consciousness with which you act. If you act from greed, hatred, or delusion, you reinforce those qualities in yourself. If you act from generosity, compassion, and wisdom, you reinforce those qualities. Will understands this intellectually, but it's difficult to accept emotionally. His whole life has been oriented toward outcomes, toward getting what he wants through whatever means necessary. The idea of acting rightly without attachment to results feels both liberating and terrifying. As the conversation continues into the evening, Will makes his decision. He will not help Aldehyde. He will not facilitate the exploitation of Paula. He will stay on the island and face whatever comes with the Palanese. It's not a heroic decision. He knows it probably won't change anything. But it's an authentic one, aligned with who he is becoming rather than who he has been. Chapter 11. The Moksha Experience Journey Beyond the Ego. Having made his decision about his mission, Will feels ready for the experience Dr. Robert offered weeks earlier, the Moksha medicine. He approaches Dr. Robert and Suzilla, expressing his readiness, and they begin several days of preparation. The preparation involves several elements. First, clarifying intention. Why does Will want this experience? What is he hoping to learn or understand? Will articulates several intentions. To understand consciousness beyond his ordinary ego self, to work through remaining fear and resistance, to experience the kind of expanded awareness the Palanese speak of, and ultimately to deepen the transformation he has already begun. Second, creating the right mental and emotional set. Through meditation, conversation, and continued therapy work, Will prepares his mind and heart for the journey ahead. Suzilla helps him address any remaining anxieties or resistances, ensuring he approaches the experience with openness rather than fear or rigid expectations. Third, physical preparation, diet, rest, and abstaining from alcohol. Finally, education about what to expect. Dr. Robert and Suzilla describe the typical arc of a moksha experience. The initial enhancement of sensory perception, the gradual dissolution of ordinary ego boundaries, the possibility of challenging content arising from the unconscious, the potential for mystical or unitive experiences, and the eventual return to ordinary consciousness. The day of the experience arrives. It will take place in a special room prepared for this purpose, beautiful, peaceful, with windows overlooking the garden. Suzilla and Dr. Robert will be present throughout as guides. The moksha medicine is administered in a ceremonial manner, with intentions spoken and gratitude expressed. Will drinks the preparation, a tea made from the sacred mushroom, bitter but not unpleasant. Then he lies back on comfortable cushions and waits. For perhaps 30 minutes, nothing obvious happens, though Will notices a subtle shift in his perception, a kind of alertness or heightened presence. Then the experience begins in earnest. Colors become more vivid, more saturated. Will looks at a flower in a vase and sees not just a flower but an explosion of color and form, each petal a miracle of structure and beauty. He becomes fascinated by his own hand, seeing it as if for the first time, the intricate patterns of lines and whorls, the play of light on skin, the miracle of its form and function. As the experience deepens, Will's sense of self begins to shift. Ordinarily, he experiences himself as a clearly bounded entity, here, separate from everything else which is there. But now those boundaries become permeable. Looking at the flower, he's not sure where the flower ends and his perception of it begins. Are they separate? Or are they a unity, flower and perceiving of flower as a single event? This dissolution of subject-object boundaries is both exhilarating and disorienting. Will feels himself expanding, his awareness reaching beyond the usual confines of body and personality. He becomes aware of consciousness itself, not his consciousness, not Will Farnaby's awareness, but awareness as such, the field of knowing within which all experience arises. Dr. Robert's voice comes from nearby, gentle and grounding. Stay with it. Don't try to control or understand. Just observe, just be aware. You're safe. This is what consciousness is when it's not constrained by the narrow ego self. Will relaxes into the experience, letting go of the need to maintain his ordinary sense of self. And as he does, something remarkable happens. He experiences what can only be described as unity, a direct perception that everything is connected, that separation is an illusion, that at the deepest level, there is only one consciousness, one being, expressing itself through countless forms. Looking at Suzilla sitting nearby, Will sees not just another person but consciousness regarding itself, love recognizing love. The boundaries between self and other dissolve completely, and there is simply presence, awareness, being. Tears stream down Will's face, but they are not tears of sadness. They're tears of recognition, of coming home, of seeing what has always been true but hidden by the filters of ordinary consciousness. Everything is perfect, he hears himself saying. Everything has always been perfect. How did I not see this? The experience continues, taking Will through various phases. At one point, he confronts the shadow material he's been avoiding, the manipulativeness, the cruelty, the capacity for harm that exists within him. He sees himself clearly, without the usual defenses and rationalizations, and it's painful. But the pain is clean rather than toxic, revealing rather than diminishing. With Suzilla's guidance, Will works through this shadow confrontation. He sees that his negative behaviors have come from pain and fear, from the wounded child trying to protect himself through control and manipulation. He feels genuine remorse for harm he has caused, particularly to Molly. But the remorse is not self-hatred. It's clean grief and determination to do better. Then the experience shifts again into what Huxley calls the clear light of the void, a state of pure awareness beyond all content, beyond all form. Will experiences consciousness in its pristine, primordial nature, not aware of anything in particular but simply aware, luminous, empty, and full simultaneously. Time stops. The self as a construct completely dissolves. There is just this, pure being, pure presence, pure awareness. How long this state lasts, Will cannot say. In one sense, it's outside time entirely. But gradually, slowly, the ordinary world begins to reconstitute itself. Forms emerge from the formless. The sense of being Will Farnaby returns. But he is not the same Will who took the medicine hours earlier. Something fundamental has shifted. As the peak experience fades, Will enters a phase of profound peace and clarity. The world looks familiar again, but there's a transparency to it, a luminous quality. He sees ordinary things, the room, Suzilla, the garden outside, but they're not ordinary at all. They're miraculous, suffused with beauty and meaning. Dr. Robert guides him to sit up to drink some water to begin the process of reintegration. How was it? He asks with a warm smile. Will struggles to find words. I don't know how to describe it. I experienced, I understood something that I can't quite put into language, but it was real, more real than what we usually call reality. Over the next several hours, as the medicine gradually wears off completely, Will talks with Suzilla and Dr. Robert about his experience. They help him make sense of what he encountered, connecting it to the philosophical and spiritual frameworks that have been developed over centuries to interpret such states. They emphasize the importance of integration, bringing the insights from expanded consciousness back into ordinary life. The moksha experience is not an end in itself, Dr. Robert explains. It's a tool for transformation. The question is, how will you live differently based on what you've seen? How will you embody in daily life the insights you've glimpsed in this expanded state? This question becomes central to Will's remaining time on Pala. He has seen something, call it reality, truth, the nature of consciousness, that changes everything. But seeing is not enough. The challenge is to integrate that vision into how he actually lives. The days following the moksha experience are characterized by a subtle but pervasive shift in Will's awareness. He's not continuously in an expanded state, ordinary consciousness returns. But it's somehow different, more transparent. He's more present, less caught in thought, more aware of the awareness itself that underlies all experience. He spends time integrating the experience through meditation, journaling, and conversations with Suzilla. He works on identifying the specific ways his life needs to change to align with what he has seen. Some changes are internal, letting go of old resentments, forgiving himself and others, accepting what cannot be changed. Others are more external, commitments to act with greater integrity, to be more present in relationships, to serve something larger than his ego self. His relationship with Suzilla deepens into something more explicitly romantic and potentially sexual. The attraction has been present for weeks, but Will has been uncertain whether to act on it. But in the days after his moksha experience, something shifts. There's a possibility now for authentic connection rather than the manipulative pseudo-relationships of his past. One evening, walking in the garden, they kiss for the first time. It's tender and present, without the urgency and desperation that has characterized Will's sexuality in the past. When Suzilla invites him to her home, they make love in a way that Will has never experienced before, conscious, present, spiritually aware. Drawing on the tantric practices that are part of Palin culture, they integrate sexuality with meditation, maintaining awareness and breath consciousness. Experiencing physical union as an expression of the deeper unity Will glimpsed in his moksha experience. This sexual connection is profoundly different from anything in Will's previous experience. There's no performance, no anxiety, no using the other person to fill an emptiness. Instead, there's presence, vulnerability, mutual giving, and receiving. It's not just physically pleasurable, but emotionally and even spiritually nourishing. Will feel seen and accepted in a way he never has before. Afterward, lying together in the darkness, they talk about what's happening between them. Suzilla acknowledges that she's still mourning Dugald and probably will be for years. But grief and love aren't mutually exclusive. I can hold my love for Dugald and my grief at his death while also being open to new connection. She asks Will about his intentions and expectations. This directness is characteristic of Palin culture. They don't play games, don't manipulate. Will responds with unaccustomed honesty. I don't know what this is or where it's going. I know I'm drawn to you, that I care about you, that being with you feels more real than anything I've experienced in years. Beyond that, I'm uncertain. Suzilla accepts this. Uncertainty is okay. We don't need to define this or make promises about the future. We can just be present with what is. Let things unfold naturally and see what develops. This conversation and the relationship itself represents yet another aspect of Will's transformation. He's learning to be in relationship differently, with honesty rather than manipulation, with presence rather than fantasy, with acceptance rather than desperate need. Chapter 12. Integration, deepening practice, and the approach of crisis. The weeks following Will's moksha experience and the deepening of his relationship with Suzilla are characterized by a kind of peaceful intensity. Will has found a provisional answer to the question of how to live. With awareness, with integrity, with compassion, with presence, he practices meditation daily, sometimes alone and sometimes in group sessions with other Palinese. He continues therapy work with Suzilla, addressing remaining psychological issues and learning to catch old patterns before they fully activate. He also participates more fully in community life, helping with agricultural work, attending educational sessions and cultural events, building friendships. During this period, Will also wrestles with the question of what happens after Pala. His old life is clearly impossible to return to. He cannot go back to working for aldehyde. But what are his alternatives? Stay on Pala, if that's even possible given the political situation. Try to find work elsewhere that aligns with his transformed values. Use his journalistic skills to write about and promote the Palin approach. These practical questions are unresolved, but they don't produce the anxiety they once would have. Will is learning to live with uncertainty, to make decisions based on present clarity rather than desperate need for security. He's learning what the Palinese call skillful action, doing what seems right in each moment while accepting that outcomes are ultimately beyond control. One afternoon, Will joins Vijaya and several other young Palinese men for a hike into the mountains. The conversation turns to politics and the future. The young men are aware of the threats facing their society, and their responses vary. Some are angry and want to resist more actively. Others are resigned. Still others maintain hope for some compromise. Vijaya articulates a perspective that synthesizes these positions. I think we have to distinguish between Pala as a physical place and Pala as an idea, a set of practices and values. As a physical place with political independence, Pala may be ending. But as an idea, as a demonstration that human beings can live with wisdom, sustainability, and genuine happiness, Pala can continue. If what we've learned here spreads, if people in other places adopt even some of our approaches, then our experiment succeeds even if this particular society falls. The conversation becomes animated, with various perspectives voiced. What strikes Will most is the quality of the disagreement. These young men are passionately engaged with high-stakes questions, yet the conversation remains respectful, thoughtful, willing to see multiple sides. As they reach a high vista with sweeping views of the island below, conversation pauses. The terraced rice paddies, the forests, the villages, the ocean, it's breathtakingly beautiful, and it may all be about to change dramatically. Will feels grief rising, not just for Pala, but for all the beautiful, fragile things in the world that are destroyed by greed and power. Yet even in his grief, there's something else. Gratitude that such things exist at all, that human beings are capable of creating beauty and wisdom. Back in the valley that evening, Will joins Dr. Robert and several others for dinner. The conversation turns to the political situation, which is deteriorating. Murugan is days away from his official coming-of-age ceremony, at which point he will assume full authority as Raja. Colonel Deepa's forces are conducting military exercises near the border, clearly positioning troops for invasion. The Rani is meeting with religious conservatives and outside oil interests, coordinating the transformation of Palin society. The council has made a final decision. They will not resist militarily, but will engage in non-violent non-cooperation if invasion comes. They will refuse to legitimize or facilitate the new regime, will continue to educate children according to Palin principles as long as possible, will maintain their practices of meditation and consciousness work, will speak truth about what's happening, but they will not take up arms, will not compromise their core principles even to preserve their society. Dr. Robert explains the reasoning. If we defend ourselves through violence, we become what we're fighting against. We validate the very worldview we oppose, that power and domination are the ultimate realities. We'd rather lose while maintaining our integrity than win through means that contradict our deepest values. A younger council member asks, but isn't there something self-indulgent about that position? Isn't maintaining our moral purity while allowing people to suffer a kind of ethical narcissism? Dr. Robert takes the question seriously. It's a genuine dilemma. Gandhi wrestled with it, Martin Luther King wrestled with it. The answer, I think, is that violent resistance to violence ultimately strengthens the system of violence. It confirms that might makes right. Nonviolent resistance, even when it fails in the short term, plants seeds that can flower later. It demonstrates that another way is possible. This argument doesn't fully satisfy everyone present, which Dr. Robert acknowledges. I'm not claiming certainty. Perhaps our commitment to nonviolence is a mistake. Perhaps a more pragmatic approach would better serve our people's well-being. I don't know. What I do know is that we have to act according to our deepest convictions, whatever the outcome. Later, alone with Suzilla, Will expresses his admiration for and frustration with the Palanese position. I understand the integrity of it, but part of me wants to scream fight. Don't just let them destroy everything you've built. Suzilla responds thoughtfully. The anger at injustice is legitimate and healthy, but the belief that violence is the only or best response, that may indeed be old conditioning. The truth is, we don't know what will work. We're all doing our best with imperfect information and limited options. She adds, what I know is this. I'd rather die having lived according to my values than survive by betraying them. Not because I'm certain my values are correct, but because integrity is all we really have. Everything else is contingent and uncertain. But the quality of consciousness we bring to each moment, the values we embody in our choices, that's real and within our control. As the evening ends and Will walks back through the dark garden, he hears once again the call of the mynah birds. Attention, here and now, boys. The call has become familiar, even beloved. He stops, becomes present to the moment. The cool night air, the scent of flowers, the sound of insects, the stars overhead. Whatever is coming, whatever challenges and losses await, this moment is real and precious. Chapter 13, The Gathering Storm and Final Choices. The days before Murugan's coming-of-age ceremony are tense with anticipation and foreboding. Everyone on Pala knows what's coming, yet life continues. Children go to school, farmers tend their fields, people meditate and make love and eat their meals. This ability to maintain everyday life in the face of impending catastrophe is itself a kind of wisdom, Will realizes. You don't stop living because tragedy is approaching. The ceremony itself is elaborate, steeped in tradition, yet also incorporating modern Palan elements. Murugan, dressed in ceremonial robes, goes through various rituals marking his transition to adult authority. He receives blessings from elders, makes ritual offerings, and recites traditional oaths. There are speeches celebrating his coming of age and expressing hopes for his wisdom in leadership. But underlying the ceremony is deep unease. Those who know Murugan and the Rani understand that this day marks not the continuation of Palan tradition, but likely its end. When Murugan speaks, his words confirm this. He talks about modernization and progress, about Pala joining the community of nations, and developing its resources. He thanks Colonel Deepa for his friendship and support. The coded language is clear to everyone present. After the ceremony, the council convenes for an emergency session. Murugan has officially invited Colonel Deepa's forces to enter Pala to provide security and developmental assistance. This is, of course, an invasion masquerading as an invitation, but Murugan has the legal authority to issue it. The Constitution gives him this power as Raja, and the Council cannot override him on this matter. The debate in Council is passionate. Some members argue for declaring the invitation invalid, for attempting to depose Murugan on grounds that he's betraying his constitutional duties. Others point out that this would be a coup, equally unconstitutional and contrary to Palan principles. A compromise position suggests reaching out to international organizations, appealing for help and protection. But even those advocating this approach recognize it's unlikely to succeed. Pala has no powerful allies, and the international community has little incentive to protect a tiny island with valuable resources. Dr. Robert, speaking from his position as a senior council member, articulates what many are thinking but reluctant to say. We need to accept that we've lost. The Pala we've known, the society our ancestors built, is ending. Now the question is, how do we navigate this ending with grace and wisdom? How do we preserve what can be preserved? How do we plant seeds for the future, even if we won't see them flower? This is met with protest from younger members who don't want to surrender so easily. But Dr. Robert continues, I'm not suggesting passivity. I'm suggesting clarity about the situation. Deepa's forces will cross the border within days. They'll take control of military and police functions, secure the oil fields, and begin implementing changes to transform Pala according to their interests. We cannot prevent this through force. We're vastly outmatched militarily. The question is, what can we actually do? A long discussion follows, generating various proposals. The council decides on a multi-pronged approach. First, document everything, record Palan practices, write down educational curricula, film demonstrations of techniques and methods. If Palan society ends, at least its wisdom can be preserved for others. Second, continue education as long as possible. Even under occupation, teach children according to Palan principles in homes and in formal settings if schools are shut down. Third, maintain spiritual practices, meditation, moksha ceremonies where possible, the cultivation of consciousness that is the heart of Palan culture. These can continue even under oppression. Fourth, engage in nonviolent non-cooperation, refuse to legitimize or facilitate the new regime, speak truth about what's happening, resist through civil disobedience when conscience demands it. Fifth, protect each other. Use the MAC system and community networks to provide support, shelter, and assistance to those most vulnerable. It's not a plan for victory, but for meaningful resistance and survival. The hope is that Palan culture can persist in some form, even if Palan political independence ends, and that someday conditions might change to allow its revival. Will observes all this with a mix of admiration, grief, and frustration. The Palanese are facing catastrophe with remarkable dignity and clarity, but part of him still wants them to fight more desperately, to rage against what's happening. Yet he also recognizes this is his own conditioning, the Western belief that aggressive resistance is always superior to acceptance. That evening, Colonel Deepa's forces begin crossing the border. There's no formal declaration of war. It's presented as a peacekeeping mission invited by the legitimate ruler. The council issues a statement declaring this an invasion and calling for nonviolent resistance, but there's little they can actually do to stop it. The invasion is methodical and overwhelming. Rendang soldiers, well-armed and disciplined, move through the island systematically. They secure strategic sites, the harbors, the airport, government buildings, the radio station. They announce that martial law is in effect, that there will be a curfew, that any resistance will be met with force. The message is clear: comply or face consequences. Some Palanese do resist, gathering for nonviolent protests, refusing to cooperate with military orders. Most of these demonstrations are dispersed without violence, but there are reports of beatings and arrests. The council advises people to be strategic in their resistance, don't provoke confrontations that will give the occupation forces justification for harsh crackdowns, but also don't collaborate or legitimize the new regime. Dr. Robert is placed under house arrest along with other council leaders. Suzilla and others are interrogated about the moksha medicine, which the new authorities consider a dangerous drug that must be eliminated. Schools are ordered closed pending reform of their curricula. The oil surveys begin immediately, with foreign technicians arriving to assess the reserves and plan extraction. Through all this, Will remains with the Palanese, staying at Dr. Robert's compound, now surrounded by guards. He has opportunities to leave as a foreign journalist. He could probably depart the island if he chose. But he stays, partly out of solidarity with the people who have transformed his life, partly out of a sense that bearing witness is important, partly out of love for Suzilla and unwillingness to abandon her. One night, evading the guards, Will and Suzilla meet in the garden. The moment is heavy with grief and intimacy. They make love with urgent tenderness, aware that this might be one of their last times together, that everything is changing, that the future is utterly uncertain. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, they talk about what comes next. Suzilla says she will stay and resist in whatever ways she can, continue teaching in secret, maintain practices, support others in maintaining hope and clarity. She may be arrested, she acknowledges, but that's a risk she's willing to take. Will asks if he should stay with her, and she gently discourages this. Your role now, she says, is to tell this story, write about what Paula was, what we tried to create. Let the world know that another way is possible, that we lived it even if only for a little while. That's how our experiment continues, through the seeds planted in other minds and hearts. Will protests that he doesn't want to leave her, but Suzilla is firm. I know, I don't want you to leave either, but wanting isn't the point. The question is what serves the larger good. You can do more good by leaving and writing than by staying and being imprisoned alongside me. They part knowing it may be forever. The goodbye is tender and heartbreaking. Will tells her he loves her, and Suzilla responds, I love you too, and I'm grateful we had this time together, however brief. It was real, it was precious, and nothing that happens now can diminish that. This ability to hold love and loss together, to fully embrace life while accepting its impermanence, is the essence of what Will has learned from Suzilla and the Palanese. Chapter 14. The Fall of Paradise and Seeds of Hope. The final chapter depicts the transformation of Paula with devastating efficiency. Within weeks, the society that took generations to build is dismantled systematically. The educational system is reformed, subjects like meditation and critical thinking are eliminated, replaced with religious instruction and nationalist ideology approved by the new regime. Teachers who resist are fired or arrested. The MAC system is declared illegal, only biological families are recognized, and traditional family hierarchy is enforced. The sustainable agricultural collectives are broken up, with land redistributed to large-scale commercial farms that will grow crops for export. The terraces that took generations to build are bulldozed to create larger fields for mechanized farming. Old-growth forests are cleared for timber and to make way for oil infrastructure. The careful ecological balance that the Palanese maintained is destroyed in the name of development and profit. The moksha medicine is criminalized, with possession carrying severe penalties. Many Palanese destroy their supplies rather than risk arrest, though some hide quantities for potential future use. Religious fundamentalists, empowered by the Rani, crack down on sexual education and practices they deem immoral. The open, healthy approach to sexuality that characterized Palan culture is replaced by rigid rules and shame-based moralizing. Cultural practices and institutions are suppressed or co-opted. Traditional festivals are either banned or transformed to serve nationalist and religious purposes. The emphasis on consciousness and attention is replaced by emphasis on obedience and docility. The myna birds that called attention, here and now, are systematically eliminated. Their calls are deemed disruptive to proper religious observance and social order. Perhaps most heartbreaking is what happens to the children. Those educated in the old Palan way, taught to think critically, to understand their emotions, to question authority thoughtfully, find themselves in schools that demand rote memorization, unquestioning obedience, and absorption of nationalist and religious propaganda. Some adapt, learning to hide their real thoughts. Others resist and face punishment. Still others, especially the youngest, gradually forget the old ways, absorbing the new normal as simply how things are. The oil development proceeds rapidly. Foreign companies arrive with their equipment and expertise. Wells are drilled, refineries built, pipelines laid. The wealth generated flows mostly to outside interests, with some crumbs falling to local elites like the Rani and her allies. Murugan, now fully under Deepa's control, serves as a puppet ruler, providing a facade of legitimacy to the occupation. Most Palanese understand what he has become, not a leader but a collaborator, but there's little they can do about it. Dr. Robert and other council members remain under house arrest or in actual prisons. They're treated relatively well, no torture or brutal conditions, but they are effectively silenced, unable to organize resistance or speak publicly. Some consider themselves fortunate to be alive, understanding that in many such situations, opposition leaders are simply eliminated. Suzilla continues her work underground. She gathers small groups for meditation practice, holds secret classes teaching children the old ways, provides therapy and support to those traumatized by the changes. She knows she's being watched, that arrest is likely eventually, but she persists. This underground resistance is small and fragmented, unlikely to reverse the transformation of Pala, but it maintains a flicker of the old wisdom for those who seek it. Will, meanwhile, has left the island, departing on one of the last flights before the airport is completely controlled by military authorities. He carries with him extensive notes, recordings, and memories of what Pala was. His shoulder has fully healed, the physical injury that brought him to Pala has mended, even as the society that healed him is being destroyed. Back in the West, Will begins writing. He writes about Palan education, about their approach to consciousness and meditation, about their sustainable economics and ecological wisdom, about their integration of sexuality with spirituality, about their conscious approach to dying. He writes about the people he knew: Dr. Robert's wisdom, Suzilla's compassion, Lakshmi's peaceful death, the children's remarkable presence and engagement. He also writes about the destruction of Pala, about how quickly a unique culture can be dismantled, about the forces that destroyed it: greed, fundamentalism, nationalism, the ideology of unlimited growth. He makes clear that Pala was destroyed not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well, because it represented an alternative to the dominant paradigm that could not be allowed to flourish as a counterexample. The book Will writes, we understand it to be the very book we've been reading, has mixed reception. Some readers are inspired, seeing in Pala's experiment possibilities for their own lives and societies. They begin practicing meditation, rethinking education, questioning consumer culture, exploring consciousness. Others dismiss it as fantasy, impossible utopianism that could never work in the real world. Still others read it as tragedy, confirmation that wisdom and goodness cannot survive in a world dominated by power and greed. Will himself has no illusions about his book changing the world. But he's learned that outcomes are not fully under our control, that all we can do is act according to our values and accept what comes. By documenting what Pala was, by planting seeds of its wisdom in other minds, he's doing what he can. Whether those seeds will flower and where and when is beyond his knowing. The novel ends with Will receiving a letter smuggled out of Pala. It's from Suzilla, written months after his departure. She describes the ongoing resistance, the small victories of maintaining practice and passing on wisdom despite oppression. She describes her continued love for him and her gratitude for their time together. She describes her hope that Pala's experiment, even in failing, will inspire others. But the letter's most striking passage concerns the myna birds. Despite the regime's efforts to eliminate them, some have survived, hidden in remote forests. And still, occasionally, their calls can be heard. Attention! Attention! Here and now, boys! It's a small thing, almost absurd in the context of military occupation and cultural destruction. But it's also deeply meaningful. A symbol that the essence of Palan wisdom cannot be completely eradicated, that the call to awareness persists even when societies that embody that awareness are destroyed. Will finishes reading the letter with tears streaming down his face, tears of grief for what was lost, tears of gratitude for what was experienced, tears of love for Suzilla and the Palanese, tears of commitment to honoring their legacy. He sits in meditation, as he now does daily, practicing the attention and awareness he learned on Pala. And as he sits, he hears in his mind the call of the myna birds, the call that will stay with him forever. Attention, here and now, concluding reflection, the vision and legacy of Island. Island stands as Aldous Huxley's final statement on human possibility, a vision of what we might become if we took seriously the project of creating societies designed for flourishing rather than for power or profit. Written in the shadow of nuclear weapons, the Cold War, environmental degradation, and the homogenizing forces of industrial capitalism, the novel asks whether humanity can create alternatives to the destructive patterns that seem to dominate history. The genius of Huxley's vision lies in its integration. He shows how various dimensions of human life, education, sexuality, economics, ecology, consciousness, community, death, are interconnected and must be addressed holistically. You cannot create a sustainable economy without ecological awareness and reduced materialism. You cannot have psychological health without addressing sexuality honestly. You cannot have genuine democracy without education that develops critical thinking and emotional intelligence. You cannot have peace without practices that cultivate inner peace. The Palan experiment synthesizes insights from multiple traditions. From Buddhism comes the emphasis on meditation, mindfulness, impermanence, and non-attachment. From Hinduism and Tantra comes the integration of spirituality with embodiment and sexuality. From Western science comes empiricism, critical thinking, and pragmatic problem-solving. From democratic political thought comes commitment to freedom, equality, and consent. The result is a culture that is neither purely Eastern nor Western, but genuinely synthetic, drawing on the best of both while avoiding their characteristic pitfalls. Central to this synthesis is the practice of attention or mindfulness, symbolized by the myna bird's constant reminders. Huxley understood that most human suffering stems from being lost in thought, caught in regrets about the past or anxieties about the future, unable to be present to actual experience. The Palanese practice of cultivating moment-to-moment awareness addresses this fundamental human problem, not by solving all difficulties, but by changing our relationship to them. When we're present, even difficulties become workable. When we're lost in thought, even favorable circumstances become sources of anxiety. The novel's treatment of consciousness-expanding substances through the moksha medicine remains controversial, but reflects Huxley's conviction, based on personal experience, that such compounds could serve genuine spiritual and therapeutic purposes when used responsibly. His vision of a culture that integrates psychedelic experiences with meditation practice, psychological preparation, and guided integration offers a stark alternative to both the prohibitionist and purely recreational approaches that dominate most societies. The Palanese approach to education is perhaps the novel's most practically relevant vision. Huxley imagines schools that educate the whole person, mind, body, emotions, and spirit, rather than just drilling academic content. Children learn critical thinking alongside meditation, sexuality alongside ethics, ecology alongside agriculture. They are taught to understand their own minds, to work with their emotions, to think independently while also cooperating with others. This vision has influenced alternative education movements, though it remains far from mainstream practice. The economic vision, a steady-state economy oriented toward genuine well-being rather than growth, is increasingly relevant as ecological limits become undeniable. Huxley understood decades before it became common knowledge that continuous growth on a finite planet is impossible, that the pursuit of ever-increasing material consumption is a form of collective madness. The Palan alternative, modest material prosperity combined with rich non-material culture, challenges fundamental assumptions of modern economics and offers possibilities for sustainable living. The novel's treatment of death and dying presaged the hospice movement and the contemporary interest in conscious dying. Lakshmi's death, with its combination of medical care, spiritual practice, community support, and acceptance, represents a powerful alternative to the institutionalized, technology-dominated dying that characterizes modern medicine. As populations age and end-of-life questions become more pressing, the Palan approach offers wisdom worth considering. Yet the novel's ending, the destruction of Pala by forces both external and internal, acknowledges the immense challenges facing any utopian project. Huxley was clear-eyed about power. Wisdom and goodness are not sufficient to protect against those willing to use violence and manipulation. The very qualities that make a society good, openness, trust, commitment to freedom, can also make it vulnerable. This tragic recognition prevents the novel from being merely wishful thinking or naive idealism. The question the novel leaves us with is not whether utopia is achievable. Huxley knew it isn't, at least not permanently. The question is whether the attempt is worthwhile, even knowing it will eventually fail. The Palanese experiment lasted a century and produced remarkable human flourishing. That it ended doesn't invalidate what it achieved, and the wisdom developed on Pala doesn't die with the society. It can spread, influence others, be adapted to different contexts. This is ultimately the hope the novel offers, not that perfect societies can be created and maintained forever, but that human beings can develop wisdom, that better ways of living are possible, that experiments in consciousness and culture matter even when they don't succeed permanently. The seeds planted in Pala might flower elsewhere, in other times and places. The practices of attention, the integration of science and spirituality, the commitment to sustainability, the honoring of the whole human being, these can persist even when the society that embodied them falls. For contemporary readers, Island remains remarkably relevant. Its concerns, ecological sustainability, the integration of contemplative practices with modern life, education for wholeness rather than just economic productivity, conscious approaches to sexuality and death, alternatives to consumer capitalism, are as pressing now as when Huxley wrote. Perhaps more so, as we face climate change, social fragmentation, mental health crises, and the homogenizing effects of global capitalism. The novel challenges us to imagine alternatives, to experiment with different ways of living, to take seriously the cultivation of consciousness and the creation of cultures that serve human flourishing. It reminds us that the way we live now is not inevitable, that other possibilities exist, that wisdom is real and achievable even if always fragile and impermanent. Most fundamentally, Island is a call to attention, the same call the myna birds make throughout the novel. Attention to this moment, this breath, this experience. Attention to how we're actually living rather than how we think we're living. Attention to possibilities for change and growth. Attention to the preciousness of consciousness and life itself. That call remains as urgent and necessary today as it was in 1962, as urgent as it will be for as long as human beings exist and struggle with the eternal questions. How should we live? What constitutes genuine happiness? How can we create societies that bring out the best in human nature rather than the worst? What is the relationship between individual transformation and social change? How do we face suffering, loss, and death with wisdom and grace? Huxley doesn't offer final answers to these questions, but he offers something perhaps more valuable: a vision of what becomes possible when we take them seriously, when we commit to the project of conscious living and the creation of conscious cultures. Whether or not we can create another Pala, we can embody Palan wisdom in our own lives. We can practice attention. We can educate ourselves and our children holistically. We can live more sustainably. We can integrate our sexuality with our spirituality. We can face death more consciously. We can build communities of practice and mutual support. The myna birds still call, even if only in our imagination. Attention, here and now, boys. The question is whether we will heed that call, whether we will wake up to the lives we're actually living, whether we will have the courage to imagine and create alternatives to the destructive patterns that dominate our world. The fate of Pala suggests that such efforts may not succeed in the way we hope, that wisdom and goodness may not triumph over power and greed. But it also suggests that the attempt is worthwhile, that the cultivation of consciousness and the creation of beautiful alternatives matter, that seeds planted in failure can flower in unexpected ways. This is Huxley's final gift to us, not a blueprint for utopia, but an invitation to wake up, to pay attention, to live more consciously, to imagine and create alternatives, to plant seeds of wisdom even in unpromising soil. The rest, whether those seeds will grow, what fruit they will bear, how the future will unfold, is beyond our control. But the planting itself, the commitment to conscious living and the good society, is its own reward. In the end, that may be the deepest wisdom of Island. Not that we can create paradise on earth, but that the attempt to do so, pursued with awareness, integrity, and compassion, makes us more fully human.